Alors, bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Thank you everyone for joining me today. Bon matin, on est ici à la conférence, le 12e annual conférence du Centre de sécurité internationale en lien avec le réseau canadien pour la défense et la sécurité. Fait qu'aujourd'hui, on a une programmation qui est intéressante, qui continue une réflexion qu'on avait lancée l'année dernière face à l'avenir de la formation des générations de chercheurs qui viennent. So as we were thinking about next year's scholars, next year's leaders, in particular looking at the texts of Stevenson and Dion, and with the knowledge that policymakers are looking more and more for evidence-based policy analysis. How might we offer different types of evidence-based analysis? Et donc, avec cette idée, on se lance dans une discussion aujourd'hui sur les données en matière de la défense et la sécurité au Canada. Comment réfléchir plus dans une mentalité qui est structurée autour des données, puis des tests quantitatifs ou des autres types d'analyses qui sont plutôt mixtes. L'idée ici, c'est vraiment d'essayer de diversifier notre avenir et aussi de donner plus de choix à nos étudiants et avec la potentialité de faire en sorte que l'Université Laval va devenir une pôle de recherche, ce qui traite les données quantitatives en lien avec la chaire en leadership en enseignement en sciences sociales numériques, Yannick Dufresne, et mon collègue Jean-Frédéric Morin qui travaille sur les régimes, la politique économique internationale et les accords de commerce. Fait que, avec ça, je passe la parole à mon collègue Richard Giguère qui va faire le point sur la programmation.
Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Permettez-moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à ce séminaire édition 2020 parrainé par le Réseau canadien sur la défense et la sécurité. Un séminaire bien spécial car tenu en cette période de pandémie qui fera justement l'objet d'un des ateliers pratiques prévus au programme aujourd'hui. Le thème privilégié cette année nous renvoie à la construction et l'analyse des données massives, une étape déterminante dans la réalisation d'une étude analytique rigoureuse, robuste et qui tient la route. J'ai souvent entendu dans le cadre de ma carrière militaire l'expression « GIGO », garbage in, garbage out, selon laquelle des données d'entrée erronées, automatiquement produisent des sorties erronées. Obtenir des données fiables a toujours constitué un défi pour les chercheurs. Définitivement pas plus facile aujourd'hui en cette période de désinformation et de fake news. Pour en rajouter, en ce qui concerne vos intérêts particuliers reliés à la défense et la sécurité, les institutions militaires sont souvent avares de détails en ce qui concerne les données à partager dans l'espace public. Il faut bien comprendre ces hésitations. Nous ne voulons pas mettre les intérêts vitaux et la sécurité de notre État à risque en raison, par exemple, d'une fuite de données classifiées imprudente. Quel intéressant paradoxe pour les forces armées que ce désir d'être à l'avant-garde des développements militaires, tout en demeurant fort discret sur les données que nous pouvons et désirons partager avec celles et ceux comme vous du domaine académique qui peuvent définitivement nous appuyer dans notre quête. Il y a quand même de l'ouverture à ce sujet. La dernière politique de défense du Canada, publiée en 2017, évoque clairement l'objectif des Forces armées canadiennes de multiplier les contacts avec le milieu universitaire. Le rôle clé que le milieu universitaire peut jouer dans l'examen continu des questions de défense est clairement énoncé. Un dialogue éclairé entre les experts de la défense et la communauté universitaire est définitivement recherché. Et j'en veux pour preuve, par exemple, les programmes MINDS, Mobilisation des idées nouvelles en matière de défense et de sécurité, et ID, le programme Innovation pour la défense, l'excellence et la sécurité. Le programme ID propose des solutions cruciales aux défis relatifs à la technologie et aux capacités appliquées, tandis que MINDS est axé sur une réflexion stratégique et sur la production de connaissances dans le domaine des politiques publiques. Ensemble, MINDS et ID stimulent l'innovation et contribuent à relever les défis en matière de défense. Le rôle joué par les chercheurs universitaires dans ces programmes est primordial. Nous avons parfois la critique facile envers la défense et son caractère souvent opaque. Mais il faut être deux pour danser le tango. Il faut aussi observer l'ouverture des universités à la présence militaire pour clairement établir une relation efficace et efficiente. En ce sens, l'initiative de l'École supérieure d'études internationales de l'Université Laval de m'accueillir comme expert en résidence est, à mon avis, digne de mention et fort porteuse. Je vous souhaite donc une bien belle journée de réflexion et vous félicite et vous remercie sincèrement pour votre intérêt aux questions si importantes reliées à la défense et à la sécurité, particulièrement en la période actuelle qui est si mouvementée. Merci beaucoup, Vanessa.
Merci, Richard. Richard Giguère, le brigadier général retraité, qui est notre militaire en résidence, qui fait nos points actuels avec l'Institut militaire de Québec, que je dois constater, qui a quand même beaucoup expérimenté avec 35 années d'expérience au sein de l'armée canadienne, avec des missions à l'étranger, en Allemagne, la crise d'Oka, c'est pas à l'étranger, Haïti, Kaboul et Kandahar, aussi à Washington pendant plusieurs années, et c'est certain qu'avec les 22 ici à Québec, on est fiers de ça. Encore une fois, il a passé du temps aussi au Harvard Kennedy School et au Joint and Combined Warfighting School de Norfolk en Virginie. C'est notre plaisir qu'il sert de directeur aussi adjoint du Centre de sécurité internationale. Nous sommes fiers d'avoir un lien si fort avec nos collègues militaires ici à Québec et plus dans le réseau canadien de la défense et la sécurité.
Merci, Vanessa.
C'est mon plaisir maintenant d'introduire notre conférencière d'honneur. It's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker. Keynote speaker, Sarah McLaughlin-Mitchell, is the F. Wendell Miller Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. She received her PhD in Political Science at Michigan State University. I redacted the year. A Bachelor of Science degree in Economics and Political Science at Iowa State University. She is the author of numerous books, including this one here. Oh, can you see it? It doesn't want to come in. This one, which is the one, the Guide to the Scientific Study of International Processes, which I've now forced at least 50 students at University of Laval to read with much pleasure. She is the author of also Domestic Law Goes Global, Legal Traditions in International Courts on Cambridge University Press, Conflict, War, and Peace, A Guide to Scientific Research, and Democracy in the Eclipse of the West. She has edited several special editions of journal issues, published more than 50 journal articles, is the recipient of multiple major research grants, including those from Department of Defense and USAID. Her expertise includes international conflict, political methodology, and gender issues in academia, and of course, international relations. She is the founder of the Journeys in World Politics, co-founder of Journeys in World Politics Workshop, which is where I met Sarah several years ago at the first edition. And upon which Stephanie and I built the Women in International Security Canada. So that was one of the motivations for that. So if you've heard of that institution, Sarah also played a role in that. Has been a faculty scholar, a collegiate scholar, a graduate college outstanding faculty mentor, the Quincy Wright Distinguished Award from the International Studies Association, a distinguished alumna from Iowa, and served as president of the Peace Science Society. On top of that, she has been co-principal investigator of the Issue Correlates of War project, which is the extension of the original Correlates of War, of course, the initial data set collected by David Singer and colleagues, upon which much quantitative research has been based. And so it is with great pleasure that I invite Sarah here to speak with us about the potential for big data, how we can think about it, and how we might go ahead here in Canada. And thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me to give this talk. Yes, I did go to grad school a long time ago, and Eric Duchesne and I were in grad school together at Michigan State, so it's good to see him as well. So let me try to share my screen here. I think you have to enable me.
Yeah.
Eric also taught me some swear words and but I won't use those.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, here he is. He's claiming innocence. You should see on the bottom share screen now, I hope.
Yep. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is some insights that I've learned about maritime conflicts, and I'm going to talk about it from a data collector's perspective. So how do we collect this big data set, and what kind of insights did we learn from it? So as Anessa mentioned, the original Correlates of War project, which was run by Small and Singer, studied war in a pretty obvious way, which was to identify wars in history and then to think about what were the correlates or causes of those wars. And a lot of early projects in war did that. Of course, there was a problem that if, for example, states with nuclear weapons don't ever fight wars, then we're missing the cases of successful deterrence. So then there was an attempt to take a step backward in the escalation process and to think about militarized disputes or crises, and then to code those potential situations that could escalate to war, and then see what kind of factors increase the likelihood of war. Through that research in the quantitative community, we've learned a lot of things, such as contiguous states fight more wars, mostly because they have territorial disputes with each other. We've learned a lot about how power parity might be an increasing factor for war, how countries with militarized dispute histories or rivalries might have more wars, and how democratic dyads are more peaceful than other types of regime pairings. Now, even with the militarized dispute or crisis approach, we still have a problem because we typically code a lot of different countries into what we call the zero category. So we might take, say, all countries that share borders and then see whether they have militarized disputes. But even among the set of countries that have borders, there's a lot of variation in terms of which countries could have militarized conflicts with each other and which ones could not. And so Paul Hensel and I worked to create what's called the Issue Correlates of War project, which takes a step back further in the escalation process and seeks to understand when countries start diplomatic conflicts with each other. So we start with a set of countries that could have diplomatic conflicts. So countries that might share land borders. For maritime conflicts, it might be countries that are coastal states in the same region. For river conflicts, it could be states that share some kind of cross-border river. For identity or ethnic conflicts, if you have groups that cross borders, then that could create diplomatic conflicts. And then, of course, great powers have the opportunity to have lots of conflicts because of, colonial histories and global reach. So what we do is we start with a set of countries that could have those kind of conflicts, and then we code whether pairs of countries have diplomatic conflicts with each other. And so we only focus on situations where official government representatives challenge other countries' territory, maritime, river, or identity claims. And the challenger is the country that's the revisionist state, so trying to change the status quo, and then the target state is the country that's defending on that issue. Typically, the target state, say, might own a piece of territory or currently have control of a maritime space. If nothing happens, then the countries just preserve the issue claim status quo, or there is no issue claim essentially. And then the ICAO, or Issue Correlates of War, ICAO project, then codes every militarized or peaceful attempt to resolve that diplomatic issue. And so in the issue approach, we've identified several variables that are important factors for predicting when countries will use militarized foreign policy strategies or peaceful strategies. Those important variables is called issue salience. And so think of that as the importance of the contested stakes. So what are the resources, either tangible or intangible, that could make countries more willing to escalate the kinds of foreign policy options that they would consider. We also think about the history of both conflict and peaceful conflict management as an important factor for future what we call settlement attempts, so either militarized attempts or peaceful attempts. And then we look at a series of other variables, which I'll talk about when I apply this to thinking about maritime conflicts. Of course, if you're in Canada, maritime issues are a highly salient issue for the population. And then, of course, what we hope is that countries can have agreements. The ICAO typology identifies two types of salience. So we have what we call tangible salience. These are things like values of security, survival, or wealth, and think of these as resources, for example, that countries might contest over. And then we also think about salience on an intangible dimension in terms of more psychological factors, like this is my historic homeland, my people have always lived in this place. And so we identify a series of diplomatic conflicts using these two dimensions of salience. So issues that are high on both tangible and intangible salience tend to be territorial disputes. So disputes over land borders, contiguous land areas or islands. And so those issues are the most militarized in history. If you've read the SSIP book, you know this, right? That territorial claims lead to more wars than any other issue. We also code issues that are high in tangible salience, but low in intangible salience. So that includes both maritime competition and cross-border river claims. We think these are typically low in intangible salience because countries don't usually think about, rivers or maritime areas in this kind of psychological attachment or historical claim way. We've also collected data on an issue that is high in intangible salience but low in tangible salience. And these are what we call identity claims. So this is when one government, say Russia, has a complaint against another government, say Ukraine, over the treatment of ethnic kin in that state. You can see I have just the militarization rates across the 4 issues that ICAO has collected data on. And I should note this only covers 1900 to 2001. The territorial claim data goes back to 1816. But anyway, you can see that territorial issues have the most militarization at 41% of all claims. But note that 59% of diplomatic conflicts over territory never become militarized. So you can see that projects that focused on disputes or crises were missing a lot of cases where countries contested areas with diplomacy but did not use militarized tools to settle those. You can see that identity claims also have a high rate of militarization at 46%. Maritime issues at 29%, and then river issues are the least militarized at 11%, which is very interesting because a lot of people predicted in the 1980s that water wars would become very frequent in the future, but that's not really what's played out, at least in terms of river conflicts. So the procedures for the ICAO project involve identifying an issue claim opportunity set. So what we do is we start with a set of countries that could have, say, diplomatic conflicts over maritime areas. And then we search for potential claims using a variety of news sources. This includes both history and reference books, Scholar Google or JSTOR, looking for scholars who have written on particular conflicts. We use a lot of different media sources, including all of the sources compiled under LexisNexis, historical New York Times, London Times, lots of different news feeds or other sources. And then we also get documents from, say, the International Court of Justice or other IGOs if they've been involved in mediation or adjudication of those cases. And then what we do is, from that set of stories, we identify cases that we think qualify as issue claims according to our coding rule, and then we compile a chronology of events for each case, which is a sort of a shortened version of the historical events that happen in each case. And then from that, we use a coding instrument to assign numerical values, say, to issue salience. So we identify factors that we think make these contested issues more important, and then we use a coding instrument to convert the text of historical chronology to numeric values. And then we use that data in a lot of statistical analyses to see what kind of factors increase or decrease the potential for militarized conflict and peaceful settlement. So I'm going to give you an example here using the maritime part of the data. So a maritime claim involves explicit contention between official representatives of 2 or more countries over the ownership, access to, or usage of a maritime area. So in this particular case, we started with a list of countries that was compiled by a volume that was published by James, and those authors identified every country's potential overlapping EEZ with another country or exclusive economic zone. And so that gave us a starting point for countries that might have potential maritime diplomatic conflicts. So Russia and Ukraine, for example, have a maritime claim in the Sea of Azov and Black Sea, and those date back to Ukraine's independence. So essentially they settled the territorial border at first when Ukraine became independent, but the maritime boundary has been contested since almost since the beginning of Ukraine's independence. These are some examples of the types of issues that we identify that lead to diplomatic clashes over maritime areas. Maritime boundary delimitation is a big one, of course. The US and Canada have had several areas where they disagree on the drawing of the line in the maritime boundary, including the Gulf of Maine, the Hecate Strait and Dixon Entrance, the Beaufort Sea is another one. So These are situations where essentially there's a disagreement about how you're going to draw the baseline from the shore. There's also disagreements about what you can make claims from in terms of whether something is an island or a rock. So there are a lot of cases where countries try to make maritime claims around rocks, which essentially don't sustain life, and it's hard to have a permanent settlement there. This is one of the reasons why China, for example, has tried to build up artificial islands, right? So rocks could become islands. We also have historical rights. So in the 9-line claims by China in the South China Seas, they are making claims beyond their 200-mile nautical mile area. But that's because they claim that their fishermen have been in those areas and have historic rights basically to resources there. Canada also makes historical rights claims over the Northwest Passage, arguing that Inuit peoples living in that area and in their agreements with the Canadian government give Canada historic rights over that sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. Of course, some of the claims are merely about access to resources. The Cod Wars is probably one of the more famous cases here, where British naval vessels were protecting the rights of British fishermen in Icelandic fishing waters and contesting Iceland's claims in terms of the length of those territorial sea limits. And then there could also be navigational rights in terms of our countries allowed to move through particular straits or areas, as in the Corfu Strait case. If you're following what's happening in Southeast Asia, you know that there's China's involved in a lot of different maritime claims with its neighbors. I give some examples here of how many different claims that we've identified, and a lot of these claims, I'll show you in a bit, are very likely to be militarized based on the factors that we've identified in the Issue Correlates of War project. So one of the key variables for figuring out which claims are more likely to be militarized is what's called issue salience. And so, as I said before, we identify both tangible and intangible factors that relate to issue salience. And so what we do for each issue is identify 6 indicators that will tell us how important that issue is to the countries involved. For territorial issues, I have there in italics the things that we code for intangible salience. So these are things like, this is my historic homeland, I have some kind of prior ownership over that territory, or there's some kind of identity basis for the claim in that ethnic kin are living in those areas. For river and maritime, we think that mostly the salience of the issues is tangible in terms of the resources that are being contested. So we code a lot of things like, for rivers, it might be fishing or hydroelectric power, irrigation. And for maritime areas, we code things like the presence of fishing resources, oil, migratory fish stocks, which move across 2 EEZ boundaries, strategic locations for shipping, and whether maritime claims relate to territorial claims. Like in the case of Russia, Ukraine, there's also a territorial claim over the Crimea. So what we've identified is how many militarized and peaceful settlement attempts we have for each of those ICAO issue claims. And here I have a comparison of the frequency and militarization of territorial claims. So these are traditional either land border claims or island ownership of islands. And then maritime claims, like I just showed you a bunch of examples of what those kind of claims look like. We've identified 270 dyadic maritime claims globally between 1900 and 2010. And you can see that while the militarization rate is about 29% of these diplomatic issues, it varies across regions. So Asia, for example, has a higher militarization rate of their maritime conflicts at 47%, and the Western Hemisphere historically has had more militarization than the baseline. We also identified 935 peaceful attempts to settle those maritime claims. Okay, so one of the things we've tried to understand is, why do countries make diplomatic claims? Why do they militarize those issues? And then how do they settle them peacefully? So for maritime issues, we start with a set of countries that could have overlapping EEZ areas in the same region. And then we also consider the fact that great powers have the ability to have maritime competition in coastal areas outside their regions. And then from that set, we identify factors that we think make diplomatic conflict more likely. Of course, a lot of maritime conflicts are an extension of land sovereignty claims. And so if there's a disagreement about the land border, there might also be a disagreement about the maritime space, as in the case of the Dixon Entrance, Hecate Strait area. They resolved the Alaska boundary issue in terms of the land border, but not the maritime border. There's also uncertainties that arise in international law, either from what kinds of claims countries can make. So historically, countries could fire off their coast cannons, for example, 3 nautical miles offshore. So that became the customary law area for how far the countries would typically make territorial sea claims. But in 1945, President Truman declared that the United States territorial sea limit would be much bigger than that, like 350 nautical miles. And so in that way, he broke the custom that existed at that time. And a lot of countries then started increasing the area of the sea that they were claiming. It's also the case that as the hegemonic naval capabilities decline, other countries become more revisionist in terms of maritime claims. So for example, the blue line is the share of global naval power held by the United States. And you can see that as the relative capabilities of the US Navy have declined, the total number of diplomatic claims over maritime spaces has increased over that same time period. Interestingly, we also find that democracies are very likely to have maritime claims with each other. One of the reasons I started collecting this data was because I looked at, when democracies have militarized conflicts with each other, what are they fighting about? And found that over 40% of those militarized disputes involved offshore fishing and oil resources. And so I wanted to figure out whether that pattern of conflict within the MID data set extended to diplomatic conflicts as well. And so Kelly Daniels and I did a study where we looked at all pairs of states that are in the same coastal region. And then, like I said, we pair every great power with these same set of countries. And so then we identify 125,000 plus dyads that could experience diplomatic conflict over maritime spaces. And we found in this case that there's about 4.6% of those years have some kind of diplomatic conflict going on. Interestingly, we did in fact confirm my long ago research that democratic dyads are more likely to have diplomatic conflicts over maritime spaces. So in this way, UK, Iceland, and the US, Canada claims are pretty typical. That why is that? Because democracies tend to be more developed. They tend to have larger fishing fleets. So they have the ability, by their sheer size and development, to make more of these claims. We also found that naval capabilities are a predictor of maritime claims, of course. So countries that have naval capabilities are more likely to have diplomatic conflicts over their maritime spaces. But also relative naval capabilities matters, so that if you have a preponderance of naval power in a dyad, you get fewer diplomatic conflicts. So in this way, China can have more leverage, say, when it's dealing with the Philippines or Vietnam than when it's dealing with Japan. We then looked at militarization of these claims. So we wanted to see if you have a diplomatic issue claim, which ones become militarized. And here we use the COW project's data set on militarized interstate disputes, or the MID data. And then we code, although what we do is we look at every MID that the project identifies, and then we only keep those disputes that are related to the issue that we've coded. So if we were coding, for example, something involving US and Canada in the, near Alaska, we would only include that militarized dispute if that clash was in fact over that particular issue. So what we find is that the salience variable is a very strong predictor of militarization. So for issues that have higher issue salience on that scale that I just showed you, the 0 to 12 scale, we find that increases the probability of militarization by 400% if you increase by 1 standard deviation on that scale. We also find that if you break down the specific indicators of salience, you learn some interesting things about militarization. The one that perhaps surprises people the most is that migratory fish stocks are the #1 variable for predicting militarization. The Navy guys never believe this, but it is true that in our data, if there are migratory stocks across EEZ areas, then it makes sense, because in a lot of cases, navies are out there defending, right, fishing vessels that are moving in these contested areas. We also find that resources and strategic location increase the probability of militarized clashes. Oil, you can see it's not statistically significant as a variable there, but if you look at the percentage probability of militarization, you'll see that it's highest for potential oil resources. So that tells us that areas that have the potential for oil exploration are more likely to see militarized clashes than after countries have already started drilling or exporting oil from those areas. And territorial claims combined with maritime claims are dangerous. So in this case, Russia-Ukraine is a dangerous dyad because it has both maritime and territorial diplomatic conflicts, but also identity claims. So the presence of multiple points of diplomatic clashing lead to the increased chances for militarization. We also find that a history of militarized conflict, of course, predicts increased probability of future conflict, drawing on the literature on rivalry and history of conflicts. For China's ongoing cases, for example, it has a more militarized history over the Senkaku Diao case than over the Spratly area. So predict a higher rate of militarization in Japan. If we look at that using all of the cases, you can see that within issue salience, the first variable is positively and significantly related to militarization, but for both types of claims that I'm looking at here, both territorial claims and maritime claims see more militarization if there's high salience of those issues. And a history of militarized disputes predicts more militarization for both types of issues. Interestingly, also, once you control for selection into those diplomatic conflicts, then we find that joint democracy, they're less likely to escalate. So once you control for the selection process, then mostly democracies are having diplomatic clashes over maritime areas, not really militarizing them that often. Interestingly here, I also found that naval power only affects maritime issues, not territorial issues. So different types of capabilities have different effects on, so naval, I guess this makes sense, right, that naval power has a stronger effect. And in particular, if a country who wants to challenge a maritime area is a stronger naval power, we get a higher likelihood of militarization over that issue. So if we apply this to what's happening with China's claims today, this implies that there's very high likelihood of future militarization. Most of China's claims score 7 to 12 on our salience variable. The average salience is about 6.7, so all of China's claims are above average on our scale. Over half of their maritime claims have at least one or more militarized disputes since 1993. And so this implies that we're very likely to see continued clashes between countries in this region in the future. And if you've been following this, they're also using interesting strategies like maritime militias. The Philippines just created its own maritime militia, so they're also using a variety of different types of strategies to pursue their claims. And then finally, we look at how do these diplomatic conflicts get resolved peacefully. Again, we find that for high issue salience, you get more attempts to try to settle those issues with diplomacy, but those peaceful settlement attempts tend to fail more often for high issue salience cases. So you get a lot of outsiders trying to help in these, very difficult to resolve issues, but they often don't succeed. But the Law of the Sea Convention, or UNCLOS, has a really strong history of success for helping countries resolve maritime conflicts. We find in our work that pairs of countries that have jointly ratified the Law of the Sea Convention are less likely to start new diplomatic conflicts over maritime areas. They're less likely to use military force to settle their existing claims, and they're more likely to agree to peaceful negotiations or the use of international courts to resolve conflicts. And we find that international courts are one of the most effective ways for settling these kind of diplomatic issues. Unfortunately, countries don't use them very often. So 1 in 10 of all people a case of arbitration or adjudication before an international court. So if we look at the peaceful attempts, again, within issue salience and a history of militarized disputes help to predict the likelihood of peaceful negotiations, although salience is less predictive for maritime claims than for territorial claims. Interestingly, though, you'll see that the joint democracy variable is now negative for maritime claims. So in other words, democracies are less willing to negotiate peacefully over maritime issues than traditional land border disputes. And again, naval capabilities matters for maritime peaceful negotiations, but not for territory. And then at the bottom there, you can see that countries that jointly belong to UNCLOS are more likely to use peaceful negotiations. What does this imply for China's ongoing cases? Well, all of the countries involved in China's maritime claims have ratified UNCLOS except for Taiwan. And so you might think, oh, well, the Permanent Court of Arbitration case is an example where this doesn't work very well because China did not appear in that 2016 case against the Philippines. But our analyses suggest that we still think that the ruling will have an important impact on the kinds of claims that China can make in the future. For example, the court ruled that countries cannot use artificial islands as a basis for making claims. So that's going to affect the kind of strategies that China would use in the future. Okay, so in terms of what we've learned about maritime conflicts, we've learned that maritime claims are likely to persist. I didn't really go through this graph very much, but essentially what we found is that there's an increasing frequency of maritime conflicts, but if you were to extend this out further, you'd see that after those two lines are the signature and then the coming into force of the Law of the Sea Convention. And after the Law of the Sea Convention came into force in 1994, we have seen a decline in the total number of maritime conflicts. But there's still a lot of claims that are ongoing today, and climate change is very likely to increase the number of future claims because the maritime spaces are ambulatory in the sense that if the land, right? If the land was land border change because of rising sea levels, then that would change the area that countries would be making off in terms of their EEZ claims. And of course, the warming in the Northwest Passage and northern sea route in general could also increase future claims. So what are some lessons that I can give you if you want to embark on your own data collection project? This is a very big project. We've been spending over 20 years working on this data collection. So yeah, maybe you don't want to get involved in a 20-year project, but here's some things that I would recommend. First of all, think about what kind of potential cases you want to code and how you're going to identify the set of cases that could be potentials for whatever you're studying. Think about the sources and the limitations of the sources that you're using. Sometimes, right, it's easier to code things that happen more recently because we have better data sources, but we also have bias, right? So the media tends to do more reporting in countries that are more democratic and wealthier, and so that limits, right, the kind of, it creates bias in some of the sources that we use. Think about the interoperability with other data sets. So we were, as Anessa said, an extension of the COW project, so we adopted the country codes from the Correlates of War project, and we made sure that our data set could be merged with other data sets in the conflict community, and it's very important. I've worked with river data, for example, that's coded by geographers, and that data is not very easily integrated with political science data sets. So think about how other people might use your data. Make sure that you have detailed instructions in a code book and code sheets for your coders. You can find examples on our ICAO website. Have clear descriptions for the end users about how the data should be used. Managing a lot of research assistants is very challenging, so I can answer questions about tips for that. And then making sure that you preserve the documentation and have a plan to archive the data, because over time, right, we used to have things in file cabinets and now we do all storage electronically, but making sure that you have backups in case you lose something. And then having realistic goals for how long it's going to take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was an extremely interesting presentation. If you wouldn't mind, we'd love to get a copy of the PowerPoint. So, because students might like to look at it a little bit longer to look at the tables and stuff.
Yeah,
sure. If you have questions, and the students or anyone in the audience, we welcome some questions. I know Richard Giguère has one, but I would like to start with one as well. In terms of, so looking at this project from a student's perspective, what types of tasks how did you organize the research assistants? What types of tasks did you have them do in some senses to get an idea, like if a student was hired on this project, what were the types of expectations they would do?
Yeah, so we've had, I don't know what the number is now, but probably over 100 at this point, different students that have worked on the project. We've had undergrads and graduate students working on the project. The undergrads help a lot with doing news searching, and so like we give them a pair of countries, a set of search terms, and then we tell them which sources we want them to use. We train them on using those sources, and then they help to search for news stories and save those for us. I've also had undergrads help with the chronology, so we give them, hundreds of news stories, and then we ask them to condense that information into a shorter historical chronology. The graduate students have been involved in all aspects of, from data, news searching to historical chronologies to doing the actual coding. We have a code sheet for each case, and so the graduate students often take the chronologies that we've already compiled and then do the coding off of those chronologies. And then the last step is, entering the numeric coding into, we use Excel spreadsheets to take that data from the coding sheets to a quantitative form. The graduate students also help do analyses with Stata or other packages, so helping to integrate our data with other data, control variables, other data sets. And I've co-authored papers with both undergraduates and graduate students. So students have also been involved as authors on some of the projects.
Richard?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Sarah. Very interesting presentation. In relation to your data collection projects, what do you think of Graham Allison's Thucydides trap and his analysis of 16 conflicts that led to 12 wars? How like in the military, we read a lot Graham Allison and his views. What do you think, and how do you compare? I know he's looking more at historical facts, but what do you think? Merci beaucoup.
Well, I think that Allison was not the first person to come up with this idea. So Ken Organsky, for example, wrote about power transition theory a long time ago. I think the evidence, the evidence for this kind of power transition theory is mixed. I think in at least our data, there's definitely evidence that power parity increases the likelihood of militarized conflict. So that's consistent with the Thucydides trap idea. We could use issue salience as a measure of dissatisfaction, right? So Organsky and Kugler found that it's not just power parity that leads to war, but also the rising state has to be dissatisfied with the rules of the game, basically. So we don't really in our analyses incorporate some of the kind of measures that power transition literature uses, but I think our findings are consistent that if you have a high salience issue and you have power parity, we do see that there's a much higher likelihood of war or militarization. So I would say our data is consistent with the basic logic of that theory.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Benjamin also has a question.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Sorry. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Deeply interesting indeed. Okay. Yes, sorry. My question is the following.
Shared offices.
Test. Yeah. All right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, technology problems. Okay, I will try to tell slowly. All right, my question is the following. Well, I find this approach quite revolutionary in the IA study, indeed. My question is the following. Maybe I missed that in your presentation, but is it possible to apply this methodology to the dynamics of non-state actors involved in territorial claims? I mean, is it a deliberate choice not to involve them in your measures, and what's your limitations about that?
Yeah, so we made a decision early on that we wanted to focus on interstate conflict, mostly because Paul Hensel and I are both interstate war scholars. But the approach has been applied to non-state actors. So Krista Wiegand, who's worked with us on the identity claims data set, has also created a new data set with Eric Keels on taking an issue claim approach to civil wars. And so coding what are the issues at stake, what do rebels or other insurgent groups want? And so that, I think they just released that data set. So that's an example of taking the kind of approach that we you know, we read when we were in grad school, you know, some of the early issue literature by Rosenau and American Foreign Policy, but also Mansbach and Vasquez's had a book in the 80s that was very influential for us. And so those early issue areas tended to do case studies. So like Mansbach and Vasquez looked at, you know, US-German versus US-Soviet interactions. And so what we tried to do is generalize that to a much larger set of cases to see if those kind of patterns hold. And yeah, so some people are taking the issue approach now and applying it to non-state actors. So I think that we, you know, I'm very happy to see that. I think it'll be give us a lot of insights about exactly which groups that make claims against governments, for example, don't militarize those issues. And so Kathleen Cunningham at Maryland has also collected data on every secessionist movement. So that's another strategy people have taken, is to identify, again, the set of cases that could escalate to intrastate violence, and then to study the pathways by which that happens. There's also, there's a new data set called Forge, which is
yeah, I think that's
there's a new data set. It's called FORGE, but that also tracks the claims that intrastate groups make.
Thank you.
Il y a des autres questions, soit par le chat ou main levée?
Oui, Anessa.
Oui.
J'ai peut-être une couple de questions.
Oui.
Hello, Sarah. Long time no see.
Yes.
I have maybe a few questions, but so I'll have to leave because I had another conference at 10. But you know, I'll wait and see what you have to say. First question is a bit more for the students. Obviously, in your data set, you have a lot of zeros. Maybe if you could come back, say, like, how you deal with all these zeros for the benefits of the students. Second, in your data, there's something you haven't mentioned, but yeah, I was curious. In terms of the MIDs and the fatal MIDs, I saw the percentage was seems to be fairly lower for Africa. So what would explain that? Why would Africa have fewer percentage of MIDs for especially for the maritime claims and overall as well? And the third one, that I'm going to take you way back, but remember when we were in grad school, there were a lot of discussions about opportunity and willingness. So Pauline, you have done a great job, obviously, to tackle the issue of opportunity. And now we talk more, a little bit more about either selection effect or treatment effect. But I was curious about the willingness. Is in your research the proxy for willingness salience? And if so, could you think about maybe a better proxy, or is that really the best we can do for a proxy to tackle willingness? So those are my three questions.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, first of all, like in the first study that I talked about, we looked at the onset of diplomatic conflicts or issue claims. And so, yeah, we took all pairs of coastal states that could have diplomatic conflicts. And yeah, you can see that we have 5,794 ones, but then the rest of the 100 and, what is that? a little less than, or a little over 120,000 cases that are zeros. So when we do this is just a logit model that we did. And we also used like a rare events logit to make sure that our model was robust too, because we had so many zeros. And so this particular analysis you get the same results whether you use logit or a rare events logit that controls for the frequency of zeros. We also use Heckman selection models in a lot of our work. So we code, for example, the onset of a claim and then the militarization of the claim in the second stage, or the use of peaceful settlement. For a lot of our variables, the effects don't really look different once we control for selection, which I think is kind of interesting. So in other words, like salience and militarization tend to have similar effects, whether you control for selection or not. Why is Africa missing? That's because we have not finishing of Africa. So in those tables there, I don't have militarization for Africa because that region has not been finalized on the. So yeah, that's just a missing. I don't have that data complete yet. So the number of claims we estimate based on what we've collected so far. And then opportunity and willingness. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the variables of the militarization model, I would definitely think of salience and a history of militarization as willingness variables. So you can think about the issue claim itself as an opportunity to have conflict, and then what would increase the willingness, right, of states to engage their militaries over these issues. And so I think that, yeah, is issue salience a good measure? I think it is a good measure in the sense that it's a very highly significant and strong predictor of when you get militarization. So it helps to discriminate between the cases that see conflict and those that don't. On the other hand, it's mostly a cross-dyadic. The effect of the variable is more across space than across time. There are some cases where the salient score can change. So for example, if oil was discovered in an area, then the salient score could change. But as you might imagine, most of our variables, right, if I go back to that list, most of those are pretty static, right? They're static factors. Like they're not really gonna change that much over time. So in that way, you could argue that the downside of using salience as a willingness variable is that it doesn't really change that much over time. So in some of my work, I've used more domestic political factors to think about timing of conflict initiation. So I've done some work on like diversionary conflict and looked at I just have a new paper on disasters. So we find, for example, in rivalry context that countries that have natural disasters and some kind of domestic conflict going on are more likely to initiate force against their rival states. And we've also found in other work that, poor economic performance at home could lead countries to initiate force against their rivals in these kind of issue claims. And so I do think, finding variables that have more temporal variation is important for understanding the specific timing of militarized conflict.
Thanks, Sarah. Great answers. I'll have to go, but I'll be back this afternoon.
All right, thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank you, Eric. Benjamin, another question? I saw a hand up, but maybe that's from the previous. Oh,
it's okay.
Oh, I see. I have to do that. Oh. Is there anybody else that has any questions or would like to ask Dr. Mitchell anything else? Well, if not, we are. Oh, question. Yes. Since the theme of the event is about using quantitative research, what is your opinion on using social network analysis?
2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up.
My grad students would be laughing right now if they heard me say that, because I'm the person that writes questions for the IR exam that say, ask them to criticize network analysis. So I think yeah, a lot of my students are using network analysis. So they're studying things like the ties. I have a student who's doing work on naming and shaming and the universal periodic review process, and looking at whether countries kind of bandwagon on, if one country shames the United States for its human rights practices, then do other countries bandwagon on that. I have another student looking at rivalry networks. So if you have, you know, using like enemy of my friend is my friend kind of logic. So looking at network ties between conflict dyads. And so yeah, I mean, I think these models are really helpful for capturing especially spatial interdependence between dyads or other actors. But the reason that I sometimes criticize them is because I think they're less they're not as good at capturing temporal variation. There are models like the Turgum model, which does allow for time-varying variables within a network analysis. But a lot of the early network analysis was not well designed to capture temporal variation. And so I would say, yeah, that's maybe one of the limitations of it's getting better, but I think that modeling strategy is great for capturing spatial interdependence and less good at capturing why we get temporal dynamics in certain kinds of behaviors.
I think it depends highly on the question of research and what you're looking at. I know our colleague Jean-Christophe Boucher did a social network analysis essentially of the Ukrainian diaspora tweeting during the Russian intervention. So looking at the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and kind of trying to understand who were the information movers that were essentially retweeting this story from their Twitter accounts. And so there you have a very kind of set question in a time period where you're really saying, okay, in this period of a couple months, who are the movers? And I think that, yeah, there are definitely questions that we can look at that can give us some information. But I agree that the time varying is a challenge in the social network analysis. Are there any other questions?
What kind of methods are the students using?
At the university, I don't know, are any students up for discussing their methods? This is the normal discussion about methods, by the way. Right now at University Laval, we're working very hard to improve training for quantitative for students. We offer, we have a series of 3 courses. So they took a course on epistemology, qualitative and quantitative. And then I offer the course for which they read your book, which is basically a more applied course on quantitative informal models just in IR. But the idea is essentially, I mean, our issue here in Canada is complicated because, one, we don't have a whole lot of Canada-specific data sets. So if you want to study Canadian defense and security, there's really only a handful. So part of it is we need to help to encourage all of these young future researchers here to help us start thinking about the types of things we want to study and what types of data we may need in the future in some senses. And so later today, we have one of the authors of the Government Actions to Terrorism, a data set that just looks on Canadian counterterrorism activity. And so really this is one of the first attempts to kind of think about what we might need and what's going to be good for the future of kind of, you know, decision makers here. So having your insight as somebody that's very internationally situated, but with a large experience kind of covering how to do this from a very brick and mortar sense is extremely helpful for our students. So thank you very much for spending the morning with us. And we would invite you, of course, to attend throughout the day. I know you have commitments and may come in and out, but at the end of the day, we're hosting a roundtable that will be chaired by Eric. And so hopefully we'll get a lot of students and professors to join us and kind of get the ball rolling with some brainstorming and really kind of get a plan laid out.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes before our next panel. So I'm going to, for those of you that would like to take a quick break, get your next cup of coffee or whatever, we're going to come back in just 5 minutes from now on the program. Hello, Laura.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Oh.
Hello, Laura. Both of you, yay!
Sorry, wrong Laura.
No, it's okay. No,
She may have been referring to you.
It's the first time I'm seeing both of you, so thank you so much for joining us. And Justin, joining us from Toronto.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Hello. Hi.
Marc-Antoine, good morning. Justin, Marc-Antoine, do you have PowerPoints?
Yes, I have one.
Okay, so I'm going to share co-hosting with you.
Yeah. Was the idea to present in French or English or?
Whatever your preference is.
All right. I mean, I don't mind, but I saw the email this morning, so maybe I could present in English. My notes are in French though.
Ça me dérange pas. Or you can do franglais. That's what I do mostly now.
Yeah, I guess I'll do franglais. It's I don't like to do it, but since my notes are in French and Laura Stevenson is chairing the panel, I guess I'll just do franglais, mostly in French, but like some key points in English, just so that that's
sorry.
No, it's
The lack of bilingualism is a constant struggle. So it's wonderful that my research program is co-directed by a fluent bilingual individual who makes sure that everything coming out of CDEM and the CES is always bilingual. In fact, we just finished launching studies in Saskatchewan and BC in both languages. Of course, no one will take them in French, but we make sure and are committed to doing that.
Of course, bien sûr. Alors, bon retour à tous et à toutes. Merci d'avoir nous rejoindre ou soit nous joindre. On est au deuxième panel, Deploying Big Data to Understand Social Behavior. And I am extremely excited to introduce the chair of the panel, but first I must apologize for spelling your name wrong. That's my fault. As I mentioned before, one of the challenges we face is that we need to get experts that are not necessarily folks in international relations, but they're people that have been thinking a lot about quantitative methods. And so we are extremely pleased to have Laura Stevenson with us, who specializes in political behavior, elections, and voting. She received her PhD from Duke University. She is the co-director of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, an investigator on the 2019 Canada Election Study, and co-investigator on the Canadian Municipal Election Study. Her research focuses on understanding institutions and context affects attitudes, electoral preferences, and engagement with politics. She has published in national and provincial and municipal elections. She is the co-author of Fighting for Votes and Provincial Battles National Prize, and co-editor of the Many Spaces of Strategic Voting and Voting Behavior in Canada. She is published in multiple journals that we all know, including Party Politics, Political Psychology, Electoral Studies, International Union of Public Opinion Research, Journal of Elections, Public Opinion, Parties, and the Canadian Journal of Political Science. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Stevenson to this panel.
Thanks for having me. So welcome everybody. And my understanding is that we have two wonderful speakers this morning, and each of them will have about 25 minutes or so to speak, and then we'll take some questions. Please correct me if I am wrong on this. So just in order of the program then, we have Justin Savoie, who's a data scientist with Vox Pop Labs, and I apologize, you do not want me to read that in the rest of his bio in French because unfortunately it's a very bad accent. But perhaps, Justin, beyond being with Vox Pop, which I'm assuming takes up tons of your time, and you produce ridiculous amounts of data all the time that have so many different uses, perhaps I'll let you continue your presentation or present any relevant information that you think we should know ahead of time.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Professor Stevenson. Yes, so I'm a data science lead at Vox Pop Lab, the company that is behind Vote Compass that many of you know. I'm also a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Toronto, where I work on text analysis, but today, the presentation is mostly about the type of work you can do with using Vote Compass data and election study data in general. I will try to just share my screen. So this works. I'm just having problem with one thing. I'm really, really sorry about that. I'll be back in less than 30 seconds.
So while we wait for Justin, maybe just a little bit of some commentary. I think Anessa was saying that you know, the data availability is something that doesn't always cross over, right? So a lot of the data we have in Canada is collected through those of us who study political behavior, or certainly elections or something like that. But it doesn't always overlap with those who study international relations or foreign policy. But we do know that all of those policy choices are influenced by what citizens think. And so there's lots of opportunities. So I'll put in a plug. I'm sure Justin will talk about the Vox Pop Lab data as well, and the Vote Compass data. But I wanted to let everybody know that certainly the Canadian election study, especially in 2019, is a very rich collection of information about how Canadians feel, not only about things within Canada, but also public policy, and some attitudes towards others as well, and attitudes towards foreigners, right, can be extremely relevant for a lot of the pressures that get put on public servants when they make public policy. And in 2019, we have very, very large sample, far larger than the standard. So in the past, we've had about 4,000 people, and we had 37,000 people take the campaign period survey, which means there's a lot of options for doing subgroup analysis, which can be very useful. And that's a way of really being able to gauge public opinion on some key things. The other type of data that I'll point everyone to is something called the Democracy Checkup, which is new to Canada. It is something that we are doing through CDEM. And it's basically a snapshot of what Canadians are thinking that will be happening every spring. So it's not meant to be an election study. Certainly we have, you know, political questions in there, but it's also meant to gauge attitudes. And I think it's really relevant, especially in times like now, when people have a lot of pressures on their own finances and things like that, to be able to use these kinds of data to get a picture of the overall environment in which policymakers are kind of making their decisions. Another resource to consider is the Canadian Opinion Research Archive and NESTAR, which is through Queen's. That's really a fantastic spot where they've brought together tons of different public opinion data from different firms, as well as the Canadian Election Study. But it's possible then to look for things like, you know, what did Environics do a survey on and stuff like that to track attitudes. So, of course, to be able to do a lot of these things, it helps to have some facility with quantitative methods. And I think that's the point, actually, of this panel in particular. And, you know, some of the abilities that you can do with the NESTAR platform, it can do some simple analyses easily enough. I mean, even Excel can do some simple things. But it is very useful to be able to understand what survey data is, its limits, as well, of course, its strengths, and how you can use that. I think sometimes, you know, looking at the analyses that we want to do for all of our research projects, it's really important to triangulate and to be able to look at different angles. And hopefully that's something that data, such as what Justin has, can be used for.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm really, really sorry. I had a problem with like the notes, and I'm not used to presenting that much on Zoom using my own PowerPoint, but I'm ready now. So again, sorry for this, and let's start. Are you guys seeing the correct thing or the split screen?
On voit les deux écrans. Les deux diapositives.
OK. Comment est-ce que je fais pour pas avoir ça comme ça?
Je sais pas, j'utilise pas vraiment PowerPoint.
Je peux probablement faire, c'est en fait, c'est...
There's an option to swap screens that you can do.
Est-ce que ça marche?
Oui. Là, on voit ta page principale seulement.
OK, finalement, je suis heureux de pouvoir partager avec vous aujourd'hui. Le sujet d'aujourd'hui, c'est la défense et la sécurité, et je suggérerais les affaires étrangères canadiennes en général. C'est un sujet qui est particulièrement d'actualité. C'est bien sûr pas mon champ principal d'expertise, mais comme Dr. Stevenson mentionnait, il y a une place ici pour sonder l'opinion publique, prendre le pouls de la population pour voir un peu où est-ce qu'on s'en va, parce qu'on est dans un monde qui est en pleine ébullition là, géopolitique. Le Canada cherche à prendre sa place dans ce monde qui est en changement, pris entre deux poids lourds, mais avec l'Europe aussi, le Moyen-Orient. Traditionnellement, l'approche canadienne était considérée comme une approche, disons, libérale, internationaliste, du moins pour le commun des mortels qui s'intéresse à l'opinion publique. Quand on pense au rôle du Canada historiquement, on pense à l'aide humanitaire, on pense au casque bleu, mais les choses sont en train de changer tranquillement. Donc, quel est le rôle du Canada dans tout ça? Je propose un coup de sonde à travers les données de la boussole électorale. Hier, quand je finissais ma présentation orale, quand je finissais ma présentation, je suis tombé sur un autre exemple qui est une étude qui a été produite la semaine dernière par Jean-Christophe Boucher, qui est également présent aujourd'hui. C'est un sondage représentatif de 1500 Canadiens. Puis la conclusion générale, c'est que les Canadiens veulent être impliqués dans les affaires mondiales en s'engageant vigoureusement. Je ne veux pas évidemment voler le scoop de Jean-Christophe ou quoi que ce soit, mais c'est simplement pour mentionner qu'à l'heure actuelle, je pense qu'on peut dire aussi que les changements vont s'accélérer à cause de la crise de la COVID peut-être, mais aussi à cause des tensions en politique américaine. Donc, c'est un sujet qui est particulièrement d'actualité présentement. C'est un sujet que je ne connais pas tant que ça, comme j'ai mentionné, donc j'ai fait une petite revue de la littérature. Ce que je trouvais intéressant, c'est l'idée que ces attitudes-là libérales internationales sont tenaces. Dans une étude de 2014, Roland Paris étudiait l'effet du changement de cap du gouvernement Harper. Est-ce que les politiques, le changement d'attitude vis-à-vis les pays au Moyen-Orient avaient réussi à changer de façon durable des attitudes? Par exemple, les Canadiens étaient pour les casques bleus. Est-ce que le changement du gouvernement Harper a réussi à avoir une influence? Puis la réponse semblait être que ces attitudes-là sont tenaces. Même chose pour la souveraineté en Arctique. Il y a eu des changements dans les années Harper jusqu'à 2015, mais sans nécessairement changer de façon profonde les comportements, les préférences des Canadiens. Ce que je propose, c'est d'utiliser 3 gros échantillons. La boussole électorale du Canada en 2011, à peu près 600 000 répondants une fois que les données sont nettoyées. 2015, 871 000 répondants une fois que c'est nettoyé. Puis la version aussi de 2019. Je mets l'accent sur 3 questions en particulier. C'est une étude qui est exploratoire. J'identifie pas d'effets causaux, c'est pas du tout mon sujet d'expertise, mais c'est simplement pour montrer certaines des possibilités qui s'offrent avec des gros échantillons, en particulier, comme Dr. Stevenson a mentionné, au niveau des interactions, au niveau de par exemple, l'affiliation partisane avec une interaction avec l'âge ou au niveau des régions, au niveau des circonscriptions. Les questions que j'ai identifiées sont une question sur les droits de la personne et le rôle du Canada à l'international. Donc, une forme de trade-off au niveau de qu'est-ce qu'on fait là, au niveau international. Est-ce qu'on risque certains des intérêts économiques pour faire avancer les droits de la personne? Une question sur les dépenses militaires, simplement sur les dépenses de l'armée, puis une question sur le montant de l'aide internationale étrangère. Il y a 2 points que je cherche à amener dans cette présentation-ci. c'est que je trouvais ça intéressant. C'est encore une fois un sujet qui est théoriquement loin de mon champ d'intérêt, mais dans les quelques études que j'ai consultées, notamment celle de Roland Paris, les résultats généraux quantitatifs d'opinion publique sont généralement présentés de trois façons dans ces études-là. Les résultats généraux sont présentés, des résultats temporels, c'est-à-dire historiques, l'évolution au niveau de l'opinion publique au Canada. Puis aussi, une chose qui revenait souvent, c'était les résultats découpés ou séparés au niveau des régions par province. Une chose qui manquait, c'est généralement une séparation ou une étude au niveau des intentions de vote, au niveau de la partisanerie. Puis, je pense qu'il y a probablement des raisons normatives pourquoi on fait attention à corréler les attitudes. C'est plus intéressant d'avoir une vision, je dirais, unie, générale, et de ne pas séparer, par exemple, les électeurs conservateurs du reste du Canada. Mais ce que mes recherches préliminaires montrent, c'est qu'il y a quand même des choses intéressantes à regarder de ce côté-là. Donc, l'importance des différences assez marquées entre les partisans conservateurs et les autres. Puis enfin, le deuxième point sur lequel je veux mettre l'accent, c'est la puissance d'un large échantillon au niveau des interactions. Donc, les interactions, par exemple, entre l'intention de vote et la circonscription électorale où les gens habitent, quelque chose qui est généralement pas possible dans une étude normale. Rapidement, parce que j'ai perdu un petit peu de temps au début à cause de mes problèmes techniques, je pars avec une question générale, une question intéressante, car c'est un compromis. Une question qui est complexe, certainement. On ne peut pas... Est-ce que vous avez perdu...
Oui, on voit ton document Word en ce moment.
Bon. Là, c'est revenu.
Ouais.
Le gouvernement canadien devrait tenir tête aux pays qui ne respectent pas les droits de la personne, même si cela peut mettre en péril les intérêts économiques du Canada. 43% des Canadiens sont plutôt en accord. Donc, une proportion assez forte des Canadiens qui sont d'accord avec cet énoncé-là. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'au Canada, c'est quelque chose qu'on retrouve je dirais, dans tous les pays occidentaux, mais une division assez importante au niveau des intentions de vote. 29% des conservateurs versus 10% des libéraux et 8% des électeurs du NPD qui pensent qu'ils sont plutôt en désaccord, qui sont fortement en désaccord ou plutôt en désaccord avec un énoncé comme ça. Si on compare ça, par exemple, à un découpage par province dans les études traditionnelles en opinion publique, l'étude de Roland Paris, par exemple, souvent, le découpage est plus au niveau des provinces, au niveau des régions. Donc, c'est juste l'idée d'explorer l'idée que la variance est principalement au niveau de l'affiliation partisane. Puis ça peut ouvrir la porte à une analyse qui est plus granulaire au niveau des intentions de vote ou autres caractéristiques socio-psychologiques. Essayer de réfléchir un peu à ça. Une autre question ici qu'on a posée lors de la boussole électorale Canada 2019, combien le gouvernement devrait-il dépenser pour l'armée? 41% des répondants croient qu'on devrait dépenser ni plus ni moins et environ 30% 33% des répondants croient qu'on devrait dépenser un petit peu plus. C'est intéressant, la différence est encore plus forte que la question précédente. Il y a au-dessus de 55% des conservateurs au Canada qui pensent qu'on devrait dépenser plus pour l'armée. C'est des résultats qu'on ne voit pas du tout chez les autres partis, que ce soit chez les électeurs du Bloc, des libéraux, du NPD. Encore une fois, je montre la comparaison avec les provinces pour montrer qu'il y a moins de variations entre les résultats, entre les intentions de vote, puis il y a moins de variations au niveau des provinces. Une chose qui est intéressante, quand on travaille avec des données, Dr. Stevenson parlait de l'étude électorale canadienne. Un des avantages importants de l'étude électorale canadienne, c'est que ça permet de reculer dans le temps, d'aller jusque dans les années 60, de voir une évolution temporelle des mesures d'opinion publique. Ce qui est intéressant avec un gros échantillon aussi, c'est qu'on peut décortiquer un petit peu plus. Donc ça, c'est l'évolution temporelle sur la question combien le gouvernement devrait-il dépenser pour l'armée. Puis, ce qui est le plus frappant, c'est l'évolution temporelle, mais qui est découpée par les intentions de vote. Puis ce qui est le plus frappant là-dedans, évidemment, c'est les grandes différences chez les électeurs bloquistes entre 2011 et 2019. Évidemment, la raison principale pour ce genre de changement-là, c'est probablement que la composition de l'électorat bloquiste s'est transformée de façon assez importante en 2011 et 2019. En 2011, le Bloc était une coalition plus vaste, avec plus de gens qui s'opposaient aux dépenses pour l'armée canadienne. En 2019, certains changements. Mais d'autres effets qui sont particulièrement intéressants, c'est les effets partisans. C'est-à-dire, si on regarde le nombre d'électeurs ou le nombre de gens qui avaient une intention de vote libérale, qui préconisait ou qui était en faveur de moins de dépenses pour le militaire en 2011 et 2019, on voit que les électeurs libéraux et les électeurs du NPD s'opposaient un petit peu plus aux dépenses de l'armée en 2011 sous l'ère Harper. 38% des libéraux en 2011 souhaitaient moins de dépenses. En 2019, c'est 15%. C'est quand même un changement assez radical, assez important. Puis, ce qui s'est passé, c'est simplement que les électeurs libéraux, sous un gouvernement de Trudeau, sont plus réceptifs à des dépenses militaires. Donc, c'est l'idée d'incorporer une analyse un petit peu plus fine, regarder les changements, pas juste temporels au niveau général, mais les changements avec d'autres avec interaction, vote et année. La dernière question que je vais analyser, c'est la question combien le Canada devrait-il consacrer à l'aide étrangère. Encore une fois, c'est une question où les électeurs des différents partis ne s'entendent pas nécessairement. Chez les conservateurs, environ la moitié des répondants croient que le niveau actuel est suffisant. Seulement 16% des conservateurs croient qu'on devrait dépenser plus pour près de un petit peu plus de 40% des libéraux et près de 45% des NPD. Ce qui est intéressant, donc encore une fois, c'est simplement des résultats qui ne surprendront certainement pas les gens autour de la table. Mais ce qui est intéressant, c'est d'aller dans les interactions. Donc, la prochaine diapositive, c'est les électeurs par groupe d'âge. Puis, le résultat principal ici, c'est que les jeunes conservateurs sont un petit peu différents des électeurs conservateurs plus âgés. Chez les jeunes conservateurs, il y a 23% des individus qui pensent que le Canada devrait dépenser un peu plus ou beaucoup plus d'aide pour l'aide étrangère. C'est des résultats qui nécessite une base de données un petit peu plus large pour faire les interactions. Ici, c'est pas un modèle statistique, c'est seulement une pondération avec pas stratification, avec une pondération à l'aide de distribution marginale, mais ça donne une idée un peu. Ce qu'on remarque aussi chez tous les partis, c'est une forme en U, c'est-à-dire les plus jeunes et les plus âgés, et ça, c'est chez tous les partis, sont pour un peu plus que le Canada consacre à l'aide étrangère. Donc, c'est intéressant de noter que chez les conservateurs aussi, il y a des différences entre les jeunes conservateurs et les vieux conservateurs. C'est quelque chose que ça prend un échantillon qui est un peu plus large pour constater. C'est possible aussi d'aller dans des analyses assez granulaires. Ici, c'est l'interaction entre la province et le vote. Donc, l'idée de pouvoir conserver un intervalle de confiance de quelques points, ça, c'est des intervalles de confiance qui ont été calculés en tenant compte du schème de pondération, donc qui prennent en compte la stratification, de pouvoir regarder un peu les différences entre libéraux et conservateurs dans une province comme le Nouveau-Brunswick ou l'Ontario ou le Québec. C'est le genre d'analyse qu'on peut faire avec des plus gros échantillons. Je termine avec une analyse qui utilise un modèle multiniveau pour... c'est simplement pour entamer une réflexion. Dans le fond, la question que je me posais, c'était la suivante. C'était, est-ce qu'il y a des différences entre les libéraux et les conservateurs dans différentes régions au Canada? Donc, c'est possible de regarder au niveau des provinces, comme j'ai fait lors de la dernière diapositive, mais avec un échantillon au-dessus de 600 000 répondants, c'est possible d'avoir plusieurs centaines, voire plusieurs milliers de répondants dans chacune des circonscriptions. Donc, ce que je présente ici, c'est les 10 circonscriptions au Canada où il y a la plus grande différence entre les électeurs libéraux et les électeurs conservateurs, et donc de Ottawa Center jusqu'à Canada-Carleton, et les 10 où il y a la plus petite différence entre les deux. C'est possible aussi de quantifier l'incertitude en utilisant, j'utilise un modèle bayésien, c'est un modèle simple où il y a en anglais, ils appellent ça random slope pour chacun des partis à l'intérieur des circonscriptions. Puis, il y a une forme pour les petites circonscriptions, le modèle multiniveau ramène les estimés vers la moyenne. Donc, c'est simplement l'idée qu'on peut aller chercher par exemple, de pouvoir savoir qu'il y a une différence d'environ 37 points dans Ottawa Centre, avec un intervalle de confiance d'environ 5 ou 6 % de chaque côté de l'estimé. C'est quelque chose qu'on ne pourrait pas faire avec un échantillon de 1000 ou 1500 répondants. Au niveau théorique, je pense que ce graphique-là est intéressant dans le sens que il montre qu'il y a des circonscriptions, notamment dans les grands centres, où il y a une plus grande différence d'opinion entre les électeurs conservateurs et les électeurs libéraux. Probablement parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gens politisés à Ottawa-Centre, à Ottawa-Vanier, à Toronto, Danforth. Par exemple, à Toronto, Danforth, il y a probablement pas beaucoup d'électeurs conservateurs, mais les quelques conservateurs à Toronto, Danforth sont des gens très conservateurs, contrairement à des circonscriptions comme l'Abitibi-Témiscamingue, le Lac-Saint-Jean, où on peut supposer qu'il y a une plus grande homogénéité des perspectives. En conclusion, c'est seulement une analyse exploratoire. J'ai cherché à montrer un peu l'importance de la partisanerie. Donc, comme je disais, dans certaines des autres études, souvent, c'est des résultats généraux ainsi que des résultats temporels, mais l'importance de la partisanerie semble être particulièrement important. Donc, essayer de regarder un petit peu plus ça. Puis, ce qui est intéressant avec un gros échantillon, c'est de pouvoir faire les interactions entre la partisanerie, la province ou la partisanerie et la circonscription ou même l'âge et la partisanerie. C'est évidemment tous des résultats qui seraient à confirmer avec un modèle formel. J'ai présenté seulement les résultats d'un modèle, mais qui est un modèle avec seulement 2 variables. le modèle bayésien à la fin. Donc, c'est pas des résultats définitifs, mais c'est pour commencer la réflexion. Donc, c'est tout pour moi. Merci beaucoup. Puis, je suis prêt pour des questions, juste pour discuter. Merci.
Merci, Justin. Thank you very much for that. Really fascinating to explore attitudes in such depth with that really rich data set. So our next presenter is Marc-Antoine Rancourt. He's a grad student at, sorry, my file is not large enough to show me where you are. Oh dear, at Laval, sorry, who's an expert in the study of public opinion and media and political methodology. So Marc-Antoine, do you want to provide us with your presentation?
Yes. I made my slide in English, but I'll be presenting in French. Merci beaucoup, Justin, pour ta présentation. C'était très pertinent. Puis, en étudiant la confiance envers la police, on étudie un peu plus un truc qui est plus local au Canada. Puis, c'est très complémentaire avec une étude de l'intérêt des gens pour les politiques étrangères et autres. Donc, moi, je m'intéresse à la confiance envers la police au Canada. Ça fait partie de mon mémoire de maîtrise. C'est une des deux études que va comporter mon mémoire. L'autre étant une analyse textuelle de réponse à questions ouvertes sur les raisons pour lesquelles les gens disent avoir confiance ou non envers la police. Donc, bref, plan de notre présentation. Donc, une définition de qu'est-ce que le terme de confiance. Surtout qu'en anglais, il y a une différence entre confidence puis le trust. Puis la question de recherche, je vais vous résumer un peu la littérature sur laquelle je me base pour dériver mes hypothèses puis en venir aux différents modèles. Puis je vous présente les résultats des modèles de régression, puis aussi des graphiques pour rendre le tout plus digérable. Puis une brève discussion sur comment on peut relier ça à la littérature, puis quelles sont les limites de l'étude. Donc, comment est-ce que j'en suis venu à choisir la confiance envers la police? Dans les dernières années, comme vous pouvez constater, il y a eu plusieurs événements très médiatisés de violences policières ou d'événements qui mettent, qui peignent la police de manière assez négative. On peut au moins s'entendre sur ça. Autour du monde. Puis au Canada, ça ne fait pas exception. Il y a Freddy Villanueva, Chantal Moore, puis on peut aussi penser aux manifestations à Toronto en 2010, à celles de Québec en 2012. Puis il y a d'autres événements, mais ça, c'est vraiment les principaux, là, ceux qui ont attiré beaucoup l'attention des médias et de la sphère politique. Donc, je constate cela. Puis en lisant un peu, en commençant ma revue de littérature, je constate qu'il y a plusieurs études qui portent sur l'impact de la couverture médiatique sur les attitudes envers la police, notamment la confiance. Donc, je me dis, je commence à croire que si, dans les dernières années, il y a eu beaucoup d'événements médiatisés, que la police n'a pas toujours eu l'air d'être compétente ou qu'il y a des questions qui ont été soulevées sur est-ce qu'on peut leur faire confiance, est-ce que la police devrait être changée? Il y a même des gens qui disent qu'on devrait abolir la police. Ça doit avoir un impact sur l'opinion publique, puis comment les gens perçoivent la police, donc sur la confiance notamment. Puis, je commence ma revue de littérature. Après avoir fait quelques analyses préliminaires avec les données de l'étude électorale, puis je constate que le sujet de la confiance envers la police a été très peu abordé au Canada. Puis quand on s'est intéressé au sujet, c'est souvent en s'intéressant à certains groupes, dont les Premières Nations, ou des groupes spécifiques dans certaines villes, où principalement, c'est les variables sociodémographiques auxquelles on s'intéresse. il n'y a pas eu vraiment de perspective d'opinion publique. Au Canada, en tout cas, dans d'autres pays, il y en a eu. Mais principalement, quand il y a eu des études sur la conférence envers la police, c'est surtout en droit, en criminologie, puis dans ce qu'on appelle le police science. Là. Donc, je considérais qu'il manquait un aspect d'opinion publique, puis que certaines variables qu'on voit dans la littérature en opinion publique qui sont la cause des attitudes ou qui peuvent expliquer les attitudes dans certains cas, notamment l'identification partisane, étaient absentes de la littérature académique. Donc, je me disais, si on teste différentes variables qui ont été testées ailleurs et certaines variables de la littérature en opinion publique, est-ce que c'est possible que les variables qui ont été testées précédemment soient moins importantes? Ou dans le fond, est-ce que c'est parce que les gens les avaient déjà testées puis il n'y avait rien là? Donc, on n'a pas jugé pertinent d'avoir une optique d'opinion publique. Ben, en regardant les données qui sont accessibles, on voit que dans les dernières années, il y a de moins en moins de gens qui ont confiance envers la police, essentiellement. Donc, ça se tient relativement stable durant les années 2000, début 2010. Puis, dans les dernières années, avec les différents événements, la couverture médiatique, de la brutalité policière, le mouvement Black Lives Matter, on voit que, du moins, on peut considérer qu'il y a un impact sur la confiance envers la police. Puis les données de l'étude électorale canadienne et celles d'un sondage qu'on a fait avec la chaire de recherche, la chaire de leadership en enseignement des sciences sociales numériques, montrent que les gens ont moins confiance qu'avant envers la police. Donc, après avoir pris connaissance de ça, ça m'a vraiment donné l'envie de poursuivre sur la lancée de l'étude de la confiance envers la police au Canada, puis d'en faire essentiellement le sujet de mon mémoire. Ça nous amène à certaines difficultés conceptuelles. Donc, moi, je suis arrivé là avec une perspective, disons, plus francophone. Je me disais, bon, moi, je vais étudier la confiance. Je commence à faire ma revue de littérature. Puis je me rends compte que les gens qui étudient l'opinion publique, les attitudes envers la police, s'entendent pas sur quel terme ils devraient utiliser. Est-ce que c'est la satisfaction envers les services de police? Est-ce que c'est le trust? Est-ce que c'est la confidence? Puis il y a des gens qui utilisent distrust et des gens qui utilisent unconfidence. Moi, je pensais écrire mon mémoire en français. Je pensais pas que ça allait être un problème à la base, mais j'ai l'intention de publier mes articles, mes études de mémoire en 1 ou 2 articles. Donc, je me suis dit, si je dois publier en anglais, c'est normal que j'adresse au moins les difficultés conceptuelles. Donc, on voit que la satisfaction envers la police, c'est un des trois concepts que les gens étudient généralement quand ils traitent des attitudes envers la police. C'est assez différent de la confiance, de ce qu'on appelle le trust, le confidence. C'est surtout lié à comment est-ce que les gens perçoivent le service que leur est rendu par la police. Donc, c'est souvent lié à des sentiments intérieurs de satisfaction, puis de gratification de ce que les services de police leur ont rendu dans leur service. La confiance, puis le trust et le confidence sont généralement plus orientés à l'extérieur. C'est souvent lié à l'interaction, une interaction émotionnelle. C'est pas seulement comme la satisfaction, parce que c'est juste un état d'esprit. On est satisfait du travail que la police a rendu, donc c'est l'essentiel de notre position. Il y a plus une interaction émotionnelle avec une institution ou avec un corps, le corps de police. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on considère comme le confidence towards the police? C'est généralement un degré de trust, essentiellement un degré de confiance que les répondants ont systématiquement lorsqu'ils pensent à la police. Donc, c'est comment est-ce que la formation, c'est le processus de formation de leurs attitudes essentiellement face à la police, puis à savoir s'ils peuvent leur faire confiance, s'ils sont reliable, puis c'est souvent, le terme confidence est souvent plus lié à l'institution de la police, puis c'est ce que j'étudie, alors que le terme trust est plus souvent utilisé pour des individus, donc les policiers en tant que tels, ou peut-être des corps de police précis. Donc, c'est pour ça que j'utilise le terme confidence quand j'écris en anglais. Bien qu'en français, on utilise confiance qui inclut confidence et trust. Donc, après tout cela, j'en viens à ma question de recherche. Je m'intéresse essentiellement à qu'est-ce qui fait que les gens ont confiance ou non envers la police. Ça, c'est la question générale dans mon mémoire. De comment est-ce qu'on peut expliquer la confiance? Comment est-ce qu'on explique la formation des attitudes envers la police au Canada? Puis, pour cette première étude, essentiellement, la question de recherche, c'est quels sont les déterminants de la confiance envers la police au Canada? La littérature est assez grande. Puis elle provient surtout, comme je vous dis, de la criminologie du droit, puis de la police science. J'ai fait une brève littérature une brève revue de la littérature de ce que je considère le plus important, puis essentiellement de ce qui est lié aux hypothèses que je teste. Il y a vraiment plus de littérature que ça. On va en venir en temps et lieu, mais ça, c'est l'essentiel de ce que vous avez à savoir pour la présentation d'aujourd'hui. Une des plus-values, je dirais, de cette étude-là, c'est le test de l'identification partisane, puis de d'autres variables de l'opinion publique. Puis l'identification partisane, l'idéologie, ce pas des variables qui ont été beaucoup testées. Ça a été testé par un ou deux auteurs seulement. Puis c'est un principe fondamental de ce qu'on appelle l'école du Michigan, qui est une école de pensée qui considère que l'identification partisane est un concept central dans la formation des attitudes, surtout envers des enjeux, puis lorsqu'il est question de voter. Donc, c'est là que vient une première hypothèse qui est que l'identification partisane est un déterminant de la confiance envers la police au Canada. Puis, un aspect qui est assez abordé, surtout dans ce qui touche la criminologie puis la sociologie, c'est tout ce qui touche au capital social, puis la confiance envers les autres. Ce qu'on appelle en anglais le interpersonal trust. Essentiellement, c'est le fait que si on a confiance envers les autres, si on a confiance envers ses voisins, envers, disons, je sais pas, les restaurateurs de son quartier, les policiers de son quartier, etc., ben, en ayant confiance à tous les autres citoyens, ben, vous avez aussi confiance dans les compagnies que ces gens-là travaillent, puis ainsi de suite. Si vous avez confiance en vos voisins, vous avez confiance s'ils sont des fonctionnaires ou s'ils sont des policiers, etc. Puis, il y a d'autres gens qui considèrent que, en fait, c'est peut-être pas nécessairement le capital social, c'est peut-être pas, disons, la peur de la criminalité, mais c'est en fait, ce qui explique la confiance envers la police, c'est vraiment comment est-ce que les gens voient les autres institutions puis le système de justice. Donc, il y a beaucoup de gens qui se sont intéressés à la confiance envers les autres institutions comme déterminant de la confiance envers la police. Puis les premiers à le faire, c'était Albrecht et Green. Puis eux autres considèrent que l'attitude envers, disons, le gouvernement, la fonction publique, les écoles publiques, etc., est un déterminant assez important de la confiance envers la police. Puis en construisant sur cette littérature-là, Kao et Série en 98, puis par la suite, Stack et Kao également en 98, inclut les institutions politiques, puis l'implication politique, aussi une satisfaction envers la vie qui, selon eux, est complémentaire à une intégration sociale bien réussie, également à une vie politique bien réussie, satisfaisante. Puis, selon eux, si on s'implique en politique, etc., on a confiance dans le système, puis on a confiance envers la police, puis les gens qui sont contents, essentiellement, n'ont pas de raison de ne pas apprécier les institutions en place, puis de ne pas être mécontents du système politique. Puis ça a été reproduit à quelques reprises, notamment une fois au Canada, quoique pas avec toutes les institutions qui sont disponibles dans l'étude électorale canadienne. on teste aussi différentes variables sur la loi et l'ordre, puis la criminalité. La littérature montre que, essentiellement, des mauvaises expériences avec certains policiers, puis une exposition à ce qu'on appelle le police misconduct. Donc, lorsque les policiers font des actes répréhensibles, sont corrélés négativement avec la confiance envers la police. Puis il y a d'autres choses comme le taux de criminalité, la consommation de nouvelles, de bulletins de nouvelles, puis la performance des forces de police locales influence aussi l'opinion qu'ont les gens envers la police. Puis il y a d'autres choses que j'aurais aimé tester, mais qui vont probablement être dans mon mémoire, mais que je passe rapidement aujourd'hui. C'est des conclusions que O'Connor a eues en 2008 lorsqu'il teste le self-reported masculinity et femininity. Donc, essentiellement, comment les gens se perçoivent, est-ce qu'ils se perçoivent de manière masculine ou féminine, puis l'interaction avec les attitudes envers la police. Donc, toutes ces différentes pans de la littérature-là, puis pour certains, s'imbriquent bien, pour d'autres, sont chacun de leur côté, nous amènent à construire un cadre théorique pour cette étude-ci, puis à dériver 6 hypothèses. Donc, la première, c'est que l'identification partisane conservatrice aurait un effet positif et significatif sur la confiance envers la police. Les rares fois où ça a été testé, l'identification partisane, c'était généralement aux États-Unis ou dans d'autres pays où est-ce qu'il y avait une division assez claire entre les partis de gauche et les partis de droite, ou les partis de centre-gauche et les partis de centre-droite. Donc, c'est généralement le parti les partisans du parti républicain sont généralement ceux qui ont le plus confiance envers la police. Donc, si on exporte cette théorie, ces résultats plutôt au Canada, on pourrait considérer que c'est les partisans du Parti conservateur qui auraient tendance à être plus confiants envers la police. On teste également le capital social ou la confiance envers les autres. On considère que ça a un effet positif et significatif sur la confiance envers la police. On teste également la confiance dans les autres institutions. On considère que si les gens ont confiance envers la police, ils devraient aussi avoir confiance dans le gouvernement, dans le système judiciaire, l'administration publique et les écoles publiques. On teste également la satisfaction envers la vie, pour les raisons expliquées précédemment, la consommation de nouvelles, principalement celle des bulletins de nouvelles à la télé, et finalement, l'enjeu le issue science, qu'on traduit en français comme la science de l'enjeu. Donc, si pour les répondants, la criminalité est un enjeu saillant, donc si c'est important pour eux autres, si c'est souvent dans leur pensée, on considère qu'ils vont avoir une confiance envers la police. Donc, un bref passage sur les données et sur la méthodologie. Donc, voici une distribution des répondants à la question avez-vous. On va venir à la question plus tard, mais essentiellement, c'est une distribution des répondants sur la confiance envers la police au Canada en 2015, utilisant les données de l'étude électorale canadienne. Donc, essentiellement, ce que le graphique de densité vous montre, c'est que la plupart des gens se trouvent à droite du centre. Donc, essentiellement, la plupart des Canadiens ont confiance envers la police, malgré le fait que dans les dernières années, moins de Canadiens ont confiance envers la police. La plupart des Canadiens ont tout de même un niveau de confiance assez élevé dans la police. Donc, on utilise les données de l'étude électorale canadienne. Pour les analyses d'aujourd'hui, j'utilise les données de 2015. Pour plusieurs raisons, notamment le fait que dans la variable d'intérêt, celle sur la confiance envers la police, en 2019, est dans le Post-Electoral Survey, et que le Post-Electoral Survey a une quantité de données manquantes qui ne permet pas d'avoir un échantillon suffisamment élevé pour pouvoir faire des analyses que je considère fiables. Donc, pour l'instant, on utilise le CS de 2019, de 2015. Puis, une autre raison, c'est que essentiellement, l'entièreté des questions qu'on a besoin s'y trouve. Puis, avant la sortie du CS de 2019, j'avais déjà commencé à préparer mes analyses avec le 2015. Donc, je préférais vous présenter quelque chose de qualité. Donc, essentiellement, notre variable dépendante, c'est, comme vous l'avez compris, la confiance envers la police. On mesure cela avec la question suivante. please indicate how much confidence you have in the following institution. Donc, veuillez indiquer quel est votre niveau de confiance dans l'institution suivante, la police. Puis les choix de réponse sont beaucoup, quand même, pas vraiment et pas du tout. Donc, on utilise des multiple linear regression pour essentiellement estimer la relation entre notre variable dépendante, qui est la confiance envers la police, puis les variables indépendantes liées à nos variables, à nos hypothèses de recherche, puis aussi aux variables de contrôle, qui sont les variables sociodémographiques classiques, comme le sexe, l'âge, l'éducation et autres, le fait d'être un immigrant, le fait d'être marié, etc. Les différentes visualisations graphiques puis les analyses sont faites avec le langage de programmation R. Donc, voici rapidement le tableau de régression quand on met les différentes analyses de régression ensemble. Je vais passer rapidement sur ça, mais essentiellement, si je vais vous donner les diapositives à la fin, là, si ça vous intéresse, vous vous intéressez au modèle 7, c'est celui qui contient toutes les variables, qui est essentiellement le modèle le plus important. Mais j'ai, pour chaque hypothèse, fait des visualisations graphiques qui vont vous aider à être capable de voir un peu mieux la relation entre la variable dépendante puis les variables indépendantes principales. Donc, essentiellement, on fait des graphiques de probabilité prédite qui permettent de voir, tout dépendant de où est-ce que les répondants se placent sur la variable indépendante, c'est quoi la probabilité qu'ils aient confiance envers la police. Essentiellement, on voit que si les gens ne sont pas partisans du Parti conservateur, donc ils ne s'identifient pas eux-mêmes au Parti conservateur, ils ont une moins grande chance de supporter la police, d'avoir confiance en la police que s'ils étaient partisans du Parti conservateur. L'effet est petit, mais il est définitivement présent, puis statistiquement significatif. Notre deuxième hypothèse, c'était la confiance envers les autres. Donc, le interpersonal trust ou le trust in others. L'effet est présent, mais définitivement petit. Si on devait, dans la conclusion, on va revenir sur les différents déterminants, puis qu'est-ce qui est statistiquement significatif, qu'est-ce qui ne l'est pas, puis qu'est-ce qu'on peut considérer comme un déterminant de la confiance envers la police. La confiance envers les autres, avec la taille de l'effet, définitivement pas un déterminant de la confiance envers la police, ce qui est assez surprenant considérant que dans plusieurs autres pays, notamment en Asie puis en Europe, on retrouve la confiance envers les autres comme un déterminant principal de la confiance envers la police. Notre troisième hypothèse était la satisfaction envers la vie. Donc, la satisfaction envers la vie qui est mesurée avec un Likert scale, si je me souviens bien. Puis, essentiellement, on voit que les gens qui sont plus satisfaits avec leur situation courante dans leur vie ont aussi tendance à être plus confiants envers la police. Puis, l'effet est statistiquement significatif et, comme on peut voir à l'écran, est visible graphiquement. Le principal prédicteur, le principal déterminant, ou le facteur explicatif, comme vous voulez, de la confiance envers la police, c'est la confiance envers les autres institutions. Sans surprise, c'est quelque chose qu'on pouvait voir dans la littérature, mais qui n'avait pas nécessairement été testé au Canada. Puis c'est intéressant de voir que sur ce point-ci, le Canada est assez similaire avec les autres pays. Je dirais même que l'effet de la confiance envers les autres institutions est probablement plus élevé que dans une grande partie des articles que j'ai lus pour faire ma littérature. C'est définitivement le déterminant principal de la confiance envers la police au Canada. On a aussi la consommation de nouvelles, celle des bulletins de nouvelles télé, qui est positive et significative, mais l'effet est petit, donc à prendre en considération. Puis finalement, on a l'enjeu on a la science de l'enjeu, ici issue salience, qui est également significatif, mais l'effet est, encore une fois, assez petit, donc à garder à l'esprit. Donc, si on revient sur nos hypothèses, puis comment est-ce comment est-ce que c'est lié avec le fait que ce soit des déterminants ou non de la confiance envers la police. L'identification partisane conservatrice, oui, mais l'effet n'est pas si grand que ça. Donc, les chances sont qu'un conservateur ait plus confiance envers la police, mais on a quand même des réserves, puis ça demanderait d'autres analyses pour pouvoir vraiment l'affirmer hors de tout doute. La confiance envers les autres, définitivement pas un déterminant de la confiance envers la police au Canada, en tout cas en utilisant les données de l'étude électorale pour 2015. Ce qui a trait à la confiance envers les autres institutions, définitivement un déterminant de la confiance envers la police au Canada. Comme vous avez pu le voir sur le troisième graphique de la section résultats. Quatrième hypothèse, la satisfaction envers la vie. Oui, on voit que ça a un effet positif et significatif sur la confiance envers la police au Canada, un peu plus que, disons, l'identification partisane. Puis, on a la consommation de bulletins de nouvelles qu'on aurait pensé qui aurait été négative et certainement significative, mais finalement, elle est positive. Ce qui est aussi quelque chose de surprenant, considérant que lorsque la consommation de nouvelles a été testée dans différents autres pays, les gens qui écoutaient plus de bulletins de nouvelles avaient généralement plus peur ou moins confiance envers la police, étaient généralement étaient moins satisfaits du travail de la police. Donc, c'est une particularité du Canada. Puis finalement, la science de l'enjeu de la criminalité pour le répondant. L'effet est présent, mais faible. Donc, à garder en tête lorsqu'on si vous retournez voir le tableau de régression ou si vous pensez pour une raison obscure à ma présentation. Donc, la contribution, ça corrobore certains résultats qui ont été trouvés ailleurs dans le monde, notamment aux États-Unis, en Europe, puis en Asie. Ce qui est assez intéressant, puis plusieurs d'entre eux n'avaient pas été testés à ce jour au Canada, donc ça nous en apprend davantage sur les attitudes envers la police au Canada. Mais ça nous montre aussi que sur certains aspects, le Canada est différent de son voisin américain. Beaucoup d'études de la confiance envers la police qui viennent des États-Unis. Donc, c'est intéressant de pouvoir, d'une certaine manière, voir sur quels aspects on est similaire, puis sur quels aspects on est un peu différent. Ça offre aussi une analyse, je dirais, originale ou du moins différente de ce qui a été déjà fait dans l'étude de la confiance envers la police au Canada. Puis, en temps et lieu, pour mon mémoire, on va avoir des données originales de 2020 puis de 2021 pour avoir une meilleure compréhension de la confiance puis la méfiance envers la police, mais en 2020 et en 2021. Donc, comme je vous ai montré au départ dans le graphique longitudinal, on voit que dans les dernières années, donc en 2019 puis en 2020, puis si la tendance se maintient peut-être en 2021, la confiance envers la police descend beaucoup. Donc, avec des données plus récentes, on va être encore mieux en mesure d'étudier la confiance ou la méfiance envers la police au Canada. Certaines limites de l'étude, c'est sûr que la confiance ou l'absence de confiance, c'est quelque chose un peu complexe, puis que ça demande... c'est pas certain que, en tout cas, à mon avis, que les sondages sont capables d'aller pleinement capturer ces attitudes-là ou bien comprendre exactement qu'est-ce qui se cache derrière la confiance envers les institutions. Donc, c'est une des raisons pour laquelle la deuxième étude de mon mémoire, c'est l'analyse textuelle de questions ouvertes. Comme ça, on est capable d'aller vraiment comprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe chez les gens pour qu'ils n'aient pas confiance en la police ou qu'ils aient confiance envers la police. Puis, vraiment d'aller chercher des aspects plus granulaires, puis de trouver peut-être des raisons ou des facteurs que des données de sondage auraient de la misère à les capter. En ce moment, dans l'étude, il n'y a aussi pas de question sur l'expérience des gens avec la police. Comme je vous ai dit, il va y avoir des nouvelles données en 2020 et en 2021 en ce qui concerne ce projet-ci. Donc, dont une question qui porte sur l'expérience des gens avec la police. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose qui va être adressé. Surtout que les études provenant de la criminologie puis du droit testent souvent cette variable-là. Puis, dans une grande partie des études, ça semble être un déterminant important. Puis, deux autres limites qui se présentent, c'est l'utilisation de données un peu plus âgées, les données du CES 2015, puis un échantillon qui est définitivement plus petit que ce que, disons, la boussole électorale pourrait offrir. Mais encore une fois, les données qui vont être disponibles en 2020 puis en 2021 pour ce projet-ci vont mettre à jour les données, puis offrir un échantillon qui est de beaucoup plus grande taille. Donc, voilà. Finalement, j'avais oublié de vous mentionner qu'essentiellement, la confiance envers les autres institutions se mesure avec une échelle de mesure, puis qu'il y a des tests qui ont été faits pour mesurer la fiabilité de la mesure de la confiance envers les institutions. Puis, essentiellement, cette échelle-là est composée de 5 institutions, les écoles publiques, l'administration publique, les médias, le gouvernement fédéral, puis les cours de justice. Donc, voilà. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Marc-Antoine. So we'll just stop sharing that screen and we'll see if there's any questions that anyone wants to raise.
Benjamin, did you have your hand up? I saw a hand, I thought. No?
I just clapped my.
Well, I would have a question that I would ask. First, in terms of, I really liked both presentations. I think that they showed a lot the diversity of what we can think about when we're interested in defense and security, and how we don't need to think about security as kind of limited to something international, and that there's more and more thinking about kind of crime and police and trust and how all of these things interact. And so one of the things that I would be interested in seeing, and I didn't see because your tables were rather quick, did you look at all for, did you control for effects any influence of being a minority? Is that one of the variables? I saw women were positively correlated with your trust. I didn't know if you looked at whether or not being a minority mattered, and having a military history, especially because we know like there's a lot of confidence related to, in fact, a lot of military people move into the police or criminal justice after they leave the military. So I was interested if you had anything. And then what did you see did you look at all the effects that may be at the provincial level for some of these things?
Yeah, we control for being an immigrant and for the religion. So I guess we can say we control for being a minority. There's like being Protestant, being Catholic, being Jewish, and being Muslim, and having no religion. And being an immigrant is a dummy variable, so it's either you're born in Canada or you're not. And we control for the fact that people are either from Quebec or not, but I did not go see into detail if there's any differences between all of the provinces. But there's no differences between Quebecers and people from the rest of Canada, at least on the question on confidence towards the police.
Would you, have you thought at all about if there would be any effects on this research because of the COVID pandemic? In some sense, the police were giving a bit of an enforcement role in terms of preventing, for instance, mobility of people. Do you think that there might be any effects on this, or do you think that the public is kind of, I don't know, assigning blame mostly to other institutions, we might say? Well,
the data collected for 2019 was pre-COVID, and we still see a rise in public distrust towards the police. And the data collected for 2020 at this point was collected in, I think, early April or late March, early April. So at like the beginning of COVID. So I don't know if that had an impact, But I guess with the data from late 2020 and early 2021, we're going to be able to see. And there are questions on the COVID-19 in those surveys. So that's definitely something I'll look into, yeah.
Je vois une question.
Oui.
Oui, ben, en fait, merci pour la présentation, c'est super instructif. Je veux savoir, est-ce que vous avez fait une comparaison avec d'autres polices à travers le monde pour voir un peu cette confiance-là, enfin, pour avoir une espèce de moyenne, en fait, pour ces polices-là. Et puis, si jamais, bon, il y a une moyenne qui est assez élevée, qu'est-ce qui expliquerait ça, en fait? Donc, c'est-à-dire, quels sont ces éléments-là qui peuvent renforcer cette satisfaction dont vous avez fait allusion, vous avez parlé?
Je n'ai pas fait de test moi-même, quoique ça va venir dans le futur, mais la littérature traite de ce qui se passe dans différents pays, puis certaines des études font comme essentiellement de l'opinion publique comparative où ils regardent dans les différents pays quels sont les facteurs explicatifs de la méfiance ou de la confiance dans la police. Ces études-là n'incluent généralement pas le Canada pour une raison qui n'est pas mentionnée. Donc, définitivement, c'est quelque chose qu'on gagnerait à l'étudier. Puis c'est déjà un side project, si je peux dire, qu'on a commencé, là, une étude qui compare le Canada à d'autres pays sur cette question-là. Parce que généralement, le Canada est laissé de côté dans les études sur la confiance envers la police.
Une des pistes pourrait être éventuellement l'utilisation par certaines polices de certains logiciels, comme Predpol, par exemple. Je sais qu'il y a eu, peut-être qu'il y en a certains qui sont intéressants aussi dans leur opérationnalisation. Donc, ça, pour moi, ça serait peut-être quelques pistes qui pourraient aider à peut-être mesurer, parce que là, on aurait quand même des éléments assez, voilà, qui permettraient de mieux cerner cette question-là. Voilà.
C'est très intéressant. Je suis content que vous l'ayez mentionné. Dans les sondages qui vont venir à la fin d'année pour le début de l'année prochaine, on ajoute justement des questions sur des actions que font la police ou des manières de travailler, même des matériels qu'ils utilisent. Donc, je vais définitivement penser à ça dans l'élaboration de sondage.
Any other questions from anybody? I mean, I think these two presentations were really illuminating about the importance, I think, of domestic attitudes and the interrelations and how people think about these topics, that we might think that people's attitudes towards the police, for example, would be somewhat unique from others, but I think it was really telling the how well it correlated with the other attitudes towards institutions, right? This general feelings, and I think the role of partisanship in both Marc-Antoine and Justin's presentations is something we have to pay a lot of attention to, because it's a framing issue, right? For how we can understand attitudes. Like they're not created anew each time we think about these things. In fact, people, as individuals, we have a basket of ideas that we hold together, and they have to be known in order to understand where our views come from.
Thank you so much to all of the participants. If there are any other questions, we're going to have a small schedule change right now. There was a little bit of a scheduling mix-up. That was probably my fault, as I was managing too many files. So one of our speakers, and I think that this is actually going to be a good thing, because it will actually dovetail pretty well with what we're talking about. Right now, we're going to have Professor Laura Dugan is going to join us, and she is a professor and associate chair of the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland. She is currently the University of Maryland Senate Chair and American Society of Criminology Vice President. Her research examines the predictors and consequences of extremist and hateful violence, the efficacy of violence prevention intervention policy and practice, and the intended and unintended consequences of government actions. She also designs methodological strategies to overcome data limitations inherent in the social sciences. Dr. Dugan is co-principal investigator of the Global Terrorism Database and co-principal investigator of the Government Actions in Terrorist Environments dataset. Dugan holds a doctorate in public policy and master in management and a master's in statistics from Carnegie Mellon. She is the co-authored Putting Terrorism into Context, Lessons Learned from the World's Most Comprehensive Database, along with more than 60 articles and book chapters. Welcome, Dr. Dugan.
Thank you, and thank you for your flexibility. I thought I was presenting this morning, and I arranged my schedule so that I can do that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you can enable that.
Yes, I will. Yes. So I'm enable the host view. I'm trying to get to it. Where do I need to get to it here? There we go. There we go. Okay, you should have it now.
Awesome, thank you. So let me, okay, do you see the slide presentation or the double screen? Slide presentation. Awesome. So thank you all for inviting me here. Thank you, Anessa, for inviting me here. I was asked to talk about data collection, and so the topic is different from what I was able to glean from the previous presentations, but I have also heard that that you all want to learn more about data collection, and certainly that's what I've spent a lot of my career doing. And so I'm going to talk about collecting, it says conflict relevant data from open sources, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the efforts we did to collect the government actions in terror environments data set. First, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I know my bio was just read, but in terms of what I'll be talking about today, the two main parts of my career that are relevant to this talk is that I'm co-principal investigator in two major data collection efforts. The first is the Global Terrorism Database, and I'm actually a founding principal investigator because we were able to set that up in such a way that we have a team of people who are collecting it, and I don't really need to be as intimately involved anymore. That is an ongoing effort. It collects every terrorist event worldwide from 1970 to the present-ish. I have written there because the last release, I believe, was in 2018 data. And so we're about a year behind in lags. The effort that I'm currently involved in and have been involved in for quite a while that I care even more about is this government actions in terror environment data. I'm going to basically be teaching lessons learned and teach you about some of the tensions that we've have confronted with collecting these types of data. And so what you can see listed below talk about this tension between human and machine coding. Machine coding is great for efficiency, but it's at least during the period of time where I've been collecting these data, it's not as awesome for accuracy. Also talk about inherent biases a little bit in open source data. And then also, actually, I'm not going to talk about ways to address biases through modeling, but I can during questions if you ask about it. And I'll go from there. So government actions and terror environments data. Basically, the motivation behind this is that we now have lots of data sets that collect terrorism data, especially the global terrorism database that I was involved in. However, while I collect data, I'm also a scholar, and the reason I collect data is because I want to ask questions for which there are no data to answer. And so it became increasingly frustrated in trying to assess what works and doesn't work for reducing terrorist violence, that we didn't really have good data on what governments do. We knew about the big things that everyone knew about, and we were able to do lots of analyses to see how these overt interventions, how effective these overt interventions are. But we also know that there's a lot of things going on behind the scene, or a lot of more subtle things that not just terrorist organizations, but their constituencies respond to that may influence their behavior. And so basically, our goal, my colleague Erica Chenoweth, who is a political scientist at Harvard, she and I met back in 2008, and we were standing in a lunch line at a conference and talking about how what we need is a data set that collects more of the subtle things that happen on a daily basis by government actors that would influence people's behavior. And so our goal was to create a country-specific events database to report those sorts of things. Now we applied for a grant and got it, and we basically were operating on a shoestring budget for quite a while, and still are. And so we don't have a global database on what every country does over an extended period of time, but we have pockets of countries during subsets of times. And I'll be focusing a lot on GATE Canada today. Before I get into that, though, I would like to show you how we conceptualize these data. So I created this chart back in 2008, I think, because when we had a wish list of the type of data that we would want to collect. And it turns out that we pretty much have stuck to this. And so I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see my mouse if I move it? Yeah, good. So there are two scales here. One is the type of action from fully repressive, which means actions by governments that can cause death. Some do cause death, and some just come very close to it, to fully conciliatory, which would be something like granting amnesty and forgiveness and things like that. And obviously there's a bunch of things in between. And then we also were interested in whether the target of the action was a discriminate target, which basically just means, is this a guilty party or somebody who's suspected of perpetrating terrorist violence, versus indiscriminate, which means other people are affected. The literature has shown that these dimensions really matter. And so what we wanted to do is be able to capture the full range of both, but we also wanted to be able to catch it, like, how do we define government actors? We wanted to be able to capture actions by politicians, by military, by the justice field, the department, or by law enforcement. And we wanted actions to be both material and non-material. And so the vision was to have all four quadrants covered by all four actors, if possible, if relevant. And also by material and non-material, we wanted to include physical actions that were very tangible, as well as things like statements that were said that are threatening or praising, because that's also relevant. And so that was the goal. And this is the conciliatory repressive scale that we created. So this is that horizontal dimension that I made reference to. And as you can see, number 7 was extreme repression showing intent to kill. I put examples in the parentheses, particularly things that were lifted from our GATE Canada data, so you can get a sense of what these look like. So full accommodation includes like signing self-governance agreements, granting independence, and there's very few full accommodations in any of our data, because that's basically allowing, that declaring a winner of a conflict. But there are conciliatory actions which include things like paying a ransom, providing economic aid to a population. Because recall, this is discriminate and indiscriminate. And so indiscriminate would be things that help, if it's conciliatory, that help a population who is perceived as the constituency for fighters. And then conciliatory statements, so those are the non-material ones. So stating support for negotiations with Taliban as an example, praising aggrieved constituencies, making verbal agreements to conciliation. We also have neutral, which oftentimes takes the form of governments infighting over what to do about a particular group or constituency. Verbal conflict, criticizing, blaming, denying responsibility, physical conflict. So this is short of risking lives, so making an arrest, convicting or sentencing, withholding funds, and things like that. So anyway, that's the scale that we're working on. And this is just a picture of something that Erica and I published back in 2012 that shows you the part of the end goal of where we're heading with this. And so this is Gate Israel. At the time, the data we collected were from 1987 to 2004. We took that conciliatory repressive scale and we basically combined 1 through 3 as conciliatory, 5 through 7 as repressive. And you can, this is quarterly data, but the analyses we ended up doing were monthly data. But you can see how the bars, which are conciliatory and repressive, maps onto Palestinian terrorist attacks, which came from the Global Terrorism Database. And so you can see that they tracked each other really closely. And so we were very much interested in looking at that type of tracking as well as doing some sort of modeling. Now, the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to tell you about how we collected these data, the general steps that we went through to get these data. Basically, I mean, a lot of what I like to do is create information from a massive thing of confusion. And so and I want to emphasize that we started this process back in 2008, and during that time, the technology that's available today wasn't available then, and also we're not computational linguistic programmers, and so you know, we did the best we could while consulting with people who were those things. And so what we did is we basically started off by collecting all news articles from Reuters. And there's a lot of reasons why we relied on Reuters for these countries that I won't get into it, although I can get into it during the questions and answers if it comes up. But we basically used Factiva to download every article that mentioned the specific country that we were studying. And so, for example, we used the search term Israel star and Turk star, like for Israel, and Turk star for Turkey. And you can see this is a screenshot of the Factiva search command that we did, is that we made sure that we tried to not get things like sports events and things like that in order to get these data. Then what we did, so we ended up with, you know, thousands and thousands of stories, as you can imagine, probably hundreds of thousands. Then what we did is we extracted lead sentences from all of those downloads using a program called Python. You guys know what Python is, using a program written in Python. And this is an example of what some of our Sri Lankan lead sentences look like. And so you can see that it's set up so that we have the unique identifier for the story. And we have the lead sentences for them. And the reason we use lead sentences is because the lead sentences, particularly with Reuters news articles, really capture who did what to whom. And so by the way, we are following the practice of Phil Schrodt, who's a political scientist who developed a program called Tabari, which I'll talk about in a second. In fact, that's what we did, is we ran this Tabari program on those lead sentences. And what Tabari does is the Tabari program basically has about 30 or 40 different dictionaries with key political actors and key verbs that describe political interactions from across the globe. And we ran the Tabari to identify the actors, the types of actions that were taken in these lead sentences and the target of these actions, which were basically actors and verbs and targets. And we preserved the lead sentence in this. So basically Phil Schroetz and his team would develop this program to look at different patterns of activity across the globe at different times. And so they were more interested in creating a method to identify rises and falls in types of political activities. We actually were interested in creating a very fancy search mechanism to identify specific government actions from a lot of noise. And so we kept the lead sentence in doing this. And then what we did is I moved this into a SAS program, and I filtered the cases according to the actors that we're interested in, our requirement for gate data is that the actor has to be a federal government actor, and that the target has to be a relevant sub-state target. And so this, as you can imagine, was pretty straightforward for Israel, because all the government actors had the code, started with the code ISR, and all Palestinian actors had the code PSE according to the dictionaries. And so I was able to do a lot of filtering that reduced the cases from like over 100,000 down to like 10,000, which is still a lot, but it's not as daunting as you'll see for some other countries, including Canada. And so once I did that, then I was able to move it to Excel to work with have our research assistants and code them. And so this is just showing you, I don't expect you to be able to read these, but basically this is showing you what we gave our research assistants. And let me use my mouse to show you. This first box shows the lead sentence, and then what we did is we asked them about the things in yellow show you what Tabari spits out, and then we had them go through and mark things actually I pre-coded it using SAS for whether it's discriminate or indiscriminate based on who the target is, as well as material and non-material based on what the verb was. But then we had graduate assistants go through and review them. And we also used interns from a terrorism center. So we had both undergrad and graduate students working on this, and then we reviewed them afterwards. So everything had 2 people review each of these. It required a lot of training and a lot of monitoring. And so this is a snippet of what Gate Israel looked like. And so you can see that the actions, currently we actually have a lot more detailed actions than we did back then, but you can see that defend verbally, shot dead, interrogated, Palestinian Newsome, suggested giving Gaza to Jordan. The target was PSE is Palestinians. Conciliatory repressive, the conc rep shows you where it falls on the scale. Discriminate is a dummy variable for whether it's discriminate or indiscriminate, and then material, non-material. So that's what it looked like. As I mentioned, the first set of countries were from a first grant, and you can see, so we had Israel, Egypt, Algeria, Turkey, and Lebanon. By far, Israel had the most cases. And we focused a lot of our analyses on that. And I'm not going to get into these particular countries right now, but I want to talk more about expanding this type of our efforts in our second grant to include Canada. And actually, the Canada Gate was not part of one major grant. It was actually, or it was not part of a combined grant. We actually had funding from Canada to collect Gate Canada, but we also are collecting Gate USA, which those 2 are bare. We collected also from the UK, India, Sri Lanka, and some other countries. It's a lot more challenging. And as you can see, one of the reasons is that there's no really easily identified constituency. So I couldn't just filter it on PSE because as you know, in Canada, there are a number of different types of constituencies. The examples here show you that Israel had the Palestinians, Turkey we had the Kurds, which was the major conflict there, although there were others. Egypt and Algeria had Islamists. Lebanon has Hezbollah and also Shia Muslims, and then Sri Lanka had Tamils. And so I'm going to focus from here on Gate Canada. And so you can see that there are multiple terrorist threats, and I say / constituencies because I want to be clear that we're not saying that those listed in this slide are terrorist organizations, but the terrorist organizations do rely on the popular support of others. And so these are the threats that came out of, and the constituencies that came out of our work with Canada. And then what also complicates it is that Canada had also received threats on their interests overseas during the period that we were studying. It involved the conflict in Afghanistan. So anyway, the last point is that we didn't feel Reuters did an enough job to capture a lot of the Canadian actions. And so what we did is we wanted to include Canadian newspapers in this effort, because what we did is we had about 15 news sources, which I'll list on the next slide. We used very broad search terms. So you can see we use LexisNexis to search these 15 news sources using just very broad searches. So we basically captured everything. And as you can imagine, we had over 14 million stories that we downloaded. This is the distribution of stories. This is approximate because we actually didn't count every single one of them. We looked at the number of downloads and then multiplied across. So you can see that we had some international news sources, but then we also hit the major newspapers in Canada to get those stories. Now, as you can imagine, relatively very few of these that are relevant to terrorists or their constituencies. And so this was a pretty major endeavor. So what we did was we used our research assistants. We did the filtering like I did with the other data sets, although we could not filter on relevant constituencies. And so what we did is we actually used our research assistants to go through and just mark for removal stories that were clearly irrelevant. And so this it required a lot of work, but it did not require them to sit and really think hard about things. If something looked like it could be relevant, they were just to skip it, mark it as 0. So their job was really to just sit back and go through and read this and mark things that should be removed. And you can see by the remove notes that they say like not CT, not national, because we're still focusing on federal actors, and so we're not capturing things by local law enforcement, local jurisdictions, for instance. This shows you. Oops, I forgot to change the title to Gate Canada, so I used the same format from another slide. Apologies. So this is the Gate Canada collection efforts. As I mentioned, there are more than 14 million news articles downloaded from 15 international and Canadian news sources. As a reference, Israel had fewer than 300,000 articles downloaded. So this was a whole other level of effort. Tabari selected, so the Tabari program selected just over 1 million of them, and by just over, like 50,000 more than 1 million lead sentences. And then we went through those million, and I moved it into SAS, and we filtered according to actor and target, and removing duplicate stories. As you can imagine, there's a lot of duplicate stories in there. So we were able to drop out over 900,000 by filtering. And so our graduate assistants and our interns, actually for this we used graduate assistants. Our graduate assistants had to review over 138,000 stories for just removal. So they were all given files to go. So I had mentioned on my second slide that I'll be talking about the tension between machine coding and human coding. As you can imagine, at this point, it would have been really helpful to have the technology, to have machine learning, and having an algorithm that would help us be able to triage and then filter out things. And this is something that I would love to get more involved in collaborating with neurolinguistic, computational linguistics to help us do this. But at the time, this is what we had to do. And we ended up removing 99,000 stories that were obviously irrelevant, which meant that we had to have our graduate assistants review more closely 38,000 or 39,000. We ended up deleting about 30,000 of those. And that left us with 9,579 Gate Canada store actions. So again, I know this could be overwhelming, but and it was, but if you recall, our major goal was to be able to capture the more subtle actions by governments that are relevant to constituencies. I think part of the reason why we have so many more than we have for some of the other countries is because of the diversity in constituencies, the diversity of threats, and also the size of the country. And I can tell you that, so my colleague Erica Chenoweth was really the force behind managing a lot of these. It was her graduate students who were doing the coding. And while I was in parallel working on collecting Gate USA, and we were running into the exact same problems as we were doing this. And we have about the same number of Gate USA stories for the same period of time. Well, let me show you what some of these data look like. So this shows you a bar chart of just 9,404 of these. You can see that by far the biggest threat is right wing. Now again, these are basically government actions that are doing something that's relevant to a grievance of the far right in Canada. So for example, these are things that, so protecting rights of minorities would be something that would raise a grievance for the far right. And so some of the more regular, subtle, daily things that the Canadian government may be addressing would raise a red flag for far right. Then you can see the next highest were Muslim relevant actions, and then separatist relevant actions. We have general listed, that's actually referring to general counterterrorism types of things. So these are more explicitly counterterrorism, whereas the other actions aren't necessarily counterterrorism. They're actions relevant to the environment. We have other listed there, and then also anti-abortion, and then Sikh. And so you can get a sense of the magnitude of these. The next slide shows you, this looks a little bit messy, but these are conciliatory and repressive actions by the Canadian government. This is just a line graph of these. And then I also included annual counts of terrorist attacks just from the Global Terrorism Database, which we actually don't end up using much of for our analyses of the Canadian data. I'm going to point out two things, probably just one thing. This is a mess. And the reason it's a mess is because it doesn't make a lot of sense to combine these government actions into one thing. And so what is perceived as repressive by the far right is going to actually be seen as conciliatory by, say, Muslim constituencies if it's Muslim relevant. And so similarly, what's seen as repressive by environmental constituencies may be seen as conciliatory by far right. And so this graph doesn't really demonstrate any sort of clear pattern. If we break it down by the four major constituencies, you can see a little bit more of patterning that seems to make sense. And so the one on the top left is right-wing constituency or far-right constituency, and we included anti-abortion with those. On the top right is Muslim constituency, then separatist and general counterterrorism activities. This shows you, this is actually analogous to the Israel graph I showed earlier, but this is very specific 2001 on forward, so since September 11th attacks, looking at government actions related to Muslims, and then also Al-Qaeda inspired attacks, which are shown in the dashed lines. The red is repressive toward Muslims and the blue is conciliatory. These are also Canadian government actions in Afghanistan and attacks against Canadians in Afghanistan. And you can see that these track each other fairly well. So I'm not going to be presenting a bunch of analyses at all, but what I am going to show you is some of the conclusions that have come out of analyses that we've done on these data. By analyzing these data, we've found that Canadian international actions are positively related to domestic actions. So in a paper that we wrote, we talk about blowback and expansion, although that is only really found when the Conservative Party was in power in Canada. We also found that international actions relevant to Muslims are positively related to domestic actions relevant to all others, not Muslims, but others. After 9/11, international actions relevant to Muslims were positively associated with repressive actions toward Muslims and others in Canada. And then also repressive actions towards Muslims in Afghanistan are positively related to Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks in Canada. So where I hope we are headed, as I said, we're hoping to find funding to collaborate with computational linguistics to be able to use the models that we've developed in the algorithms for, or I should say the definitions for gate data, so that we can more heavily rely on machine learning and capture these events a lot more faster and closer to real time. And also developing ways to understand the error patterns so that we can actually get, I would ideally like to have real-time data collection happen so that we can just use humans for quality checks rather than actual human coding. It's a pretty complex data set, as you can tell by a lot of the different moving parts. So I'm not sure how that would work yet. And I've been in talks with some people who are experts in the area of computational linguistics, but everybody's plans have been sideswiped by the global pandemic. So that's where we are. And that's all I have. Thanks. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Professor Dugan. Are there any questions from those of us that have been listening? Yes, Benjamin.
Yeah, if I may. Thank you, Mrs. Dugan. First of all, I'm very glad to meet one of the spirit behind the GTD. Your work and Gary Lafrey's work are valuable sources personally for me, so thanks a lot.
Awesome.
Presentation reminded me one of your article that you co-authored with Mr. Lafrey. I think it was putting terrorism into context. So my question is, how do you think we can conceptualize and insert into a data set government responses and interested violences from court peripheries, but with the focus on context, on representation? By that, I mean, what is considered extreme repression, as mentioned in your third slide, can be seen differently with other constituencies. Not, for example, Israel towards Hezbollah, but in more reason context. How can we conceptualize context into data? I know this is a big question, but this is also a huge pitfall in analysis.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something that I have been obsessed with, so I can address it. So like I said, I've been working really hard on the Gate USA data, and as I mentioned before, what is conciliatory to one group is repressive to another, and that really matters. And what I'm finding I need to do with those data is actually create separate data sets just based on the perspective of it. So right now I'm actually creating a data set that's just Gate USA Muslim relevant data, because in every single action is coded from the perspective of a Muslim, either someone who's just general Muslim, USA Muslim, or also from the perspective from a Muslim rebel is the code, MUSREB, or MOSREB. And so how we code it, so which item we use in the conciliatory repressive scale really depends on who the target is. And so and that's how we sort of isolate the perspectives. So the context of it. And so I have another one that's just on gate environmental. That I did that one first because there weren't as many cases. And so I was able to, I started cleaning it, focusing in on those. And so everything in those data, all the actions in those data are from the perspective of an environmentalist, whether they're somebody who's just an activist or somebody who is considered a terrorist in this country. And that helps a lot. And some of those events are in our far right database, right? Because people who are, actions that help protect the environment anger far right people who think that they're going to take jobs away. And so in this country, those are things that we have to do. So we dive pretty deeply in the context. And this is why we hope to get collaborate with machine learning people, but we also, there's a lot of subtleties that we find ourselves struggling with to make sure that we're able to capture things. And we save all the downloaded articles. So I actually am currently cleaning the Muslim data because it turns out my collaborator overrode one of the files. So we're going back and re-cleaning some of them, and I have to mark which ones I have to look up in order to see specifically. I want to read the entire article to see exactly what this action was doing and because I don't know whether it was perceived as, would be perceived as conciliatory or repressive. It depends on what the intent of it was, where the lead sentence, I mean, out of like 1,000 stories, I probably have to look up about 20 of them. And so it's not really, the lead sentence usually does a really good job of identifying it. I hope that helps.
I know that there's also been some work done by Jan Bolden in which she has done some machine coded learning of UN resolutions, and she's has come up with kind of a lexicography for understanding whether it is like a positive, negative, or a neutral in terms of how. And so she kind of has a lexicography, but that's because, I mean, she's looking specifically at UN resolutions, right? So they have the same type of language, basically. And so but in the project that I'm doing, essentially the next step is the same idea. What I have is I have a bunch of non-treaty defense and security agreements that I've collected. So like instead of thinking about NATO, we'll think about something much more lower level like NORAD. But the idea is that these agreements are actually the activity of cooperating in international relations. So they are much, much more numerous than the large treaties. And so what I'm doing now is trying to open them up essentially and look at what they are inside. And so I had done like you, essentially
It looks like you're muted.
Yeah.
Vanessa.
It kicked me out. My own mute.
Oh. Awesome.
Well, there we go.
But so I think you were talking about you were collecting lower level data.
Yeah, and so I think the idea is that these agreements, there's far more of them than treaties. And so I'm coming up with the same issue. I mean, you have, thousands of stories, that are shorter length, but I have, hundreds of agreements that can be very, very long.
Right.
Right. So we kind of have the future of this is kind of going through machine learning, like NVivo or something like that, things that we've had students use. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to do essentially as the next phase of this project will be to coordinate to have like an NVivo training where we might be able to use, data that's been collected from projects as kind of test data to see how we pilot this, how we do it, from a kind of an intellectual and a social science perspective.
My former grad student who's now collaborating with me on Gate USA data, he found a program online that basically does a sentiment analysis. Mm-hmm. And what you do is, so we actually wrote a paper together that looks at disasters and government responses to disasters. I know one of the speakers here talked a little bit about that, and how that is related to terrorist violence. And what he did is, for this program, which if you're interested, I can get the information and send it to you. What it does is you can set the baseline. So he put natural disaster as the baseline, and you stick the text in of the article, and it'll scale it as to whether it's positive or negative, the story based on the wordings. And so, like, obviously, if you don't give it a baseline for natural disaster, it's always going to come off as something awful, right? Because, you know, disasters are bad things.
Of course, by nature.
By nature. But if you set the baseline for disaster, then then it neutralizes there and reads everything around that. Okay. And so he was able to see if basically, and by reviewing the coding and doing the matches up, he was able to verify that it's looking at how the tone of the article is toward the response of the government toward the disaster. And so what we were able to find is, and we looked at Turkey, the Philippines, and I think one other country, but I can't remember right now. The UK as a comparison. And so we were able to show that when the government does, particularly if the disaster occurred in a regional area that is primarily, so in the southeast of Turkey where the Kurds are, if the disaster occurred there and it's a negative article, like basically suggesting that the government has done a terrible job in responding to it, there's more terrorism. And so that sentiment analysis was really neat to be able to go to. And like I said, he found it online. And because of the being able to set the baseline, it made it a lot more usable. And but if you're interested, I'll send you a link to that.
I know you're focusing mostly on English language sources, but one of the reasons why we've been interested in using In Vivo is because it also is multilingual. And so one of the things that we can benefit from here essentially is obviously we can do the original kind of article and data search in multiple languages. And so I think that's also one of the things that will matter in terms of when we think about how media treats some of these things. I mean, I think very much in Canada, you can look at media written in different places and definitely get a difference in tone.
Right. That's absolutely true.
And so I think when it comes to, and so what is interesting is that, you know, we can think of data that, like you're doing very much as actions and events data. The type of data that I'm collecting is very much kind of document-based data. I take it from agreements, whereas we have other colleagues that are using, you know, opinion data or survey data and stuff like that. And I think one of the things is that we need to think very broadly about, and like how you were talking about, very broadly about what it is you want and how it is that the perspective you need to take when you're collecting the data. And that's very much the key in terms of having data that's clean and that's concise and that you feel is reliable.
Yes.
I think that's also one of the other things is that we have to, I mean, we're always returning back to kind of our fundamentals of data collecting, right? Can you replicate it?
Yes.
Is it reliable? I think that's some of what you're getting to, that you feel that if you go in too far into this machine learning, that reliability aspect, we might be sacrificing that. And is that, you know, and to what extent does that bias our results in some senses?
Right. And so what I hope to be able to do is find a way to do both and then understand the error patterns with the machine learning only and then make corrections with that so that we can, I mean, because what we compromise obviously with human coding is that we lose time sensitive data, right? I'm still cleaning data from 2012.
Oh yeah.
Which is, I mean, in the US, it's a lot less relevant given what's been happening over the last 4 years. So I have to convince reviewers that what I'm publishing is still relevant today. So ideally, I'd like to find a way to be able to get the best of both, but be able to inform, because we know we'll have error in machine data. We just will. But if we can understand the error structure and be able to make adjustments to it, I think that would be helpful.
And that is also part of the fundamental reflections that we need to do when we're collecting data, because it is very much an acknowledgement that we are abstractifying from reality, and in doing that, we're making this sacrifice. And so how are we essentially cutting these challenges against each other? I see Jean-Christophe has his hand raised.
Hey everyone, how's everyone? So I have a couple of questions, and like I want to lower my hand. All right. So first, Laura, thank you so much for this presentation. somehow like that research rang a bell to me, and I realized that I was actually one of the reviewers like a while back, a positive one, where the journal decided to go like somewhere else. And I said like, wow, like this is interesting. And I know you've published this research elsewhere, and I was happy to see it published elsewhere. And I'm kind of enthusiastic in the next phase of this, like the kind of machine learning part. And a lot of the work that I do now focuses mostly on machine learning. And what sounds to me, what you're trying to do is more like a supervised model, where you would have like a human coded training set, and then you could use the training set as a way to hard code the rest of the data set. And I would, you know, and this is kind of an easy thing to do now. A lot of the models and the deep learning applications to natural language processing actually works well. The accuracy will never go over 80%, but what you lose in accuracy, you gain in efficiency and time and management. I mean, as I was, and like Anissa was talking about replication, I have a lot more faith in replicating data out of a Python code that uses machine learning than actual coders. As I go back and looking at hand coding of RAs, I mean, it's all over the place, and I'm seeing a lot of people trying to reproduce and replicate data that's been hard-coded by humans, and it's terrible, and we're unable to actually do it. And not only this, my sense is like human coding is also, I think students are like time sensitive, so trying to replicate data with different kinds of students doesn't really help a lot. And I think our field hasn't been as genuine and honest about like the quality of our coding and human coding. So I think that the machine learning part, at least I know that it's still like the algorithm will code the same thing like every time.
Right.
But you're right.
Good point.
It's the devil you know rather than the devil you don't know, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that I have with reviewers is that when I like put out like an accuracy, like an F score of like 80, and it's like, well, that's only 80% accuracy. And like, well, you know, your human coding is probably even worse. But somehow we've kind of built in that like faith that, you know, if I get students to code things and I have two coders, that solves all my issue, and I just do my Krippendorf thing and like, oh look, 80%, and like
intercoder reliability, woo!
Yeah, and then like do it again another time, and then like, whoa, it doesn't work. So I have a question about like the data collection. So I've been approached by friends in the US to do the kind of like, not what exactly you're doing, but doing like militarized interstate dispute stuff, but, you know, hard-coded through LexisNexis. And one of the problems we're getting is that LexisNexis and ProQuest are now kind of blocking off huge access, right? So we can't download like 250,000 articles. And we wanted to do this with Le Monde, and the Francophones were actually, and compare like how the Americans, you know, report news and how like the French report news and how that skews maybe the way we code these data sets. And how did you manage this? We still have access to these bulk LexisNexis things. Like I'm out, like, or they ask like, you know, like, well, give us $30,000 and we'll give you all access. Like,
so let me say, I'm going to answer this, but then I'm actually late for a different meeting because I thought we'd be done by noon. So we cheated. This is being recorded. We didn't cheat.
Pause.
It was a bear. We actually, so LexisNexis allows you to download like, I think something like 200 a day at a time. Mm-hmm. And we actually had a team of people sitting there repeatedly downloading them. It's a bigger deal with Reuters because you only get 100. And so when we were downloading Gate USA, which relies only on Reuters, we got kicked off of the servers. We actually got University of Maryland kicked off of Factiva.
All right. I've been there. I've done that too for UCalgary. All right.
Yes. And so we ended up using our interns' home institutions until they got kicked off. And so we moved to different parts of different libraries across the world. then my grad student at the time who was managing this endeavor found a library in Hong Kong who had a trial LexisNexis, or I'm sorry, not Lexis, Factiva, had a trial version of Factiva. And so we were able to download it, and he was obsessed, and he would spend his nights just downloading articles while watching TV. And so I think for USA, because we use Reuters and not 15 news sources, just Reuters, I think we had something like 4 or 5 million stories to download. And we were able to do it piecemeal. I would never do that again as long as I live. What I would do is I would apply for funding to pay the $30,000 to get basically, so the issues are you need a pipe of information in order to do this. And so we've saved the articles, but we plan on deleting them when we feel comfortable enough to do that, because we don't want to get in trouble for copyright issues. We don't share. I mean, you can see I included some of the lead stories in my slideshow. Any release data we give, we're not going to give the lead stories, but we rewrite the new action is what we call it. So, which is just the actor, the action, and the target. So we'll rewrite it. I'm cleaning some of the data, like I said, for Gate USA Muslim, and some of our coders, which I really identified with what you said, because I'm really appalled by how they coded some of these stories. But they just copy and pasted the lead sentence into a new action, which isn't informative, because if you're coding an action, you actually just need to know who did what to who, instead of getting the story of who did this in reaction to that, and some of the fluff. And so I've had to rewrite some of those. But you're right. I mean, it's a bear, and I think these news compilers caught on that we were using these stories in this way, news articles in this way, and instead of being altruistic and wanting to join in the fight for understanding terrorism, they were like, no, you can't do this unless you give us lots of money.
Yeah.
So
and that's the problem with replication, because then I can't replicate something else, and I do mostly Twitter data, and I buy this Twitter data, right? But then reviewers say I can't replicate this, and yeah, because I signed this contract with Twitter. It says I'm going to buy this data, but I'm not going to share the data, the row level data set, right? I can do the aggregate one.
Right.
There's actually I'll let you go. There's actually an algorithm that separates actions from words. So as you're doing your thing, there's actually a lexicon that allows you to kind of just focuses on the verb and not on the actual words. So that actually collects everything and parses the data set based just on actions. And that's actually interesting. There's a lot of literature in LLP on whether or not we should code by verbs or by words, and then how that changes anything. And all the research seems to say is focusing on words actually reduces computational work, but also makes more sense and is a better code. So there's research around that.
Awesome.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, and that's what the Tabari program does, and Phil Short's more recent version of it. It's really focused on the verbs, and that's what we actually wanted all the verbs, since we wanted to have an entire spectrum of actions, but the verbs were definitely the key.
There's a lexicon for that. There's something I don't I've seen it somewhere, but there's somewhere I know a data set that just records all verbs in English and all the verb tense. So that allows you to kind of focuses on one thing.
I would love to continue this conversation another time.
Yeah.
So, all right. I should go. Inessa, if you can connect the two of us, that would be awesome.
Yes, I will. No problem at all. Thank you very much.
Since I don't know what JC means.
Oh, Jean-Christophe is Jean-Christophe Boucher, University of Calgary.
Thanks, everyone.
For joining us.
Sure. Bye-bye.
And with that, we'll take our time for the lunch break. So we will see everyone back here around 1 o'clock. Thank you.